Most of what sounds right is wrong. Most of what sounds right is wrong. And this is the first and most unsettling truth about logical fallacies, that the human brain is not designed to evaluate arguments logically, but to evaluate them emotionally. And the arguments that feel the most convincing are often the ones with the most broken logic. A fallacy is not a lie. It is a pattern of reasoning that looks valid, sounds persuasive, and arrives at a conclusion that feels true, but that contains a structural flaw, a break in the chain of logic that, once you see it, makes the entire argument collapse. The problem is that you almost never see it, because the brain evaluates arguments the way it evaluates food, by how they taste rather than by what they contain. And a well-flavored fallacy tastes exactly like a valid argument. Logicians have cataloged these broken patterns for over 2,000 years, from Aristotle's original list to the modern inventory of over 100 named fallacies. And the catalog reveals something disturbing, that the same broken patterns appear in every era, every culture, every level of education, because the flaws are not in the arguments, but in the minds evaluating them. Think of the last argument that convinced you and ask whether it convinced you because the logic was sound or because the conclusion felt right. And consider that the feeling and the logic may have had nothing to do with each other. You do not need to evaluate anything tonight. Let the fallacies rest, convincing and broken, and know that tonight is about seeing the breaks, one by one, the hidden cracks in the arguments that have been shaping your beliefs, your decisions, and your reality without your permission and without your awareness. Attack the person, ignore the point. Attack the person and ignore the point. And this is the ad hominem fallacy, one of the oldest, most common, and most effective tricks in human argumentation. The strategy of discrediting the person making the argument rather than addressing the argument itself. The logic is simple and simply broken. The character, motives, or circumstances of the person speaking have no bearing on the validity of what they are saying. A dishonest person can make a true statement. A biased person can present valid evidence. An unlikable person can offer a sound argument. But the brain does not evaluate arguments separately from their source. It evaluates them as a package, and if the source can be discredited, the argument falls with it, not because the argument was wrong, but because the person was attacked. The strategy works because the audience, following the attack on the person, forgets to evaluate the point, and the point, unaddressed, is treated as defeated when it was never actually engaged. Think of the last time you dismissed an argument because you disliked the person making it, and how the dismissal felt like a response to the argument when it was actually a response to the person, and how the argument, stripped of its source, might have deserved a better hearing. You do not need to reevaluate any argument tonight. Let the fallacy rest, effective and broken, and know that the ad hominem is the oldest trick in the book, because it is the easiest, the one that lets you win an argument without ever having to address it. The argument they never actually made. The argument they never actually made is the straw man fallacy, the strategy of misrepresenting someone's position, making it weaker or more extreme than it actually is, and then attacking the misrepresentation rather than the real argument. The straw man is easier to defeat than the real opponent, which is why the strategy is so tempting. Because winning against a distorted version of the argument feels exactly like winning against the real thing. And the audience, unless they are paying very close attention, does not notice the substitution. The person says, "I think we should spend less on defense," and the opponent responds, "So you want to leave the country completely unprotected." And the response, which addresses a position no one took, feels like a devastating rebuttal of the position that was taken. The original argument is never addressed. A fictional version is defeated in its place, and the defeat of the fiction is celebrated as the defeat of the fact. Think of the last time someone responded to something you did not say, how they argued passionately against a position you did not hold, and how frustrating it was to watch your actual point be ignored while a caricature of it was attacked. You do not need to correct any misrepresentation tonight. Let the straw man rest, stuffed and easily defeated, and know that half the arguments you have lost in your life were not lost because your position was weak, but because your position was replaced, quietly, with a weaker one, and the weaker one was the one that was defeated. It must be true because they said so. It must be true because they said so. And this is the appeal to authority, the fallacy of accepting a claim as true, not because of the evidence supporting it, but because of the status of the person making it. The doctor said it, so it must be right. The expert said it, so it must be accurate. The famous person endorsed it, so it must be good. The appeal to authority is not always wrong, because experts often are right, and deferring to expertise is often rational. The fallacy occurs when the authority is treated as sufficient evidence, when the status of the speaker replaces the evaluation of the claim, and when the questioning of the claim is foreclosed by the prestige of the person making it. The authority may be speaking outside their expertise. The authority may be wrong. The authority may have interests that distort their position. But the brain, which is wired to defer to status, treats the authority's word as proof and stops evaluating. Think of a belief you hold because someone important said it, and whether you ever evaluated the claim independently or simply inherited it from the authority. You do not need to question any authority tonight. Let the deference rest, and know that the appeal to authority is one of the most socially embedded fallacies, because every culture teaches its children to trust the people at the top, and the trust, while often useful, becomes a fallacy the moment it replaces the thinking it was supposed to inform. Only two choices when there are many. Only two choices when there are many, and this is the false dilemma. The fallacy that presents a situation as having only two options when, in reality, there are more. And the presenting forces you into a choice that was never as limited as it appeared. You are either with us or against us. Either we do this or everything fails. Either you agree completely or you are the enemy. The false dilemma works because the brain prefers simple choices over complex ones, and a choice between two things is easier to process than a choice among 5 or 10. And the reduction, because it simplifies the decision, feels like clarity when it is actually a distortion. The missing options are the ones the person presenting the dilemma does not want you to consider. The moderate positions, the alternative solutions, the nuanced responses that would complicate the clean, binary choice they need you to make. Think of a time you were told you had only two options and how the telling felt like a fact rather than a framing, and how the options you were not shown might have been better than either of the ones you were forced to choose between. You do not need to choose anything tonight. Let the false dilemma rest, and know that every time someone tells you there are only two options, there are almost certainly more, hidden behind the binary, waiting for the person brave enough to say, "I see a third." If we allow this, then everything falls. If we allow this, then everything falls. And this is the slippery slope. The fallacy that argues against a position by claiming it will inevitably lead to an extreme outcome without providing evidence that the progression from the first step to the catastrophe is actually inevitable. If we allow A, then B will follow, and then C, and then D, and before you know it, Z and Z is terrible. The argument works because the catastrophic endpoint is vivid and frightening, and the chain of events leading to it, presented quickly and confidently, feels plausible even when no evidence connects the first step to the last. The fallacy is not that the progression is impossible. It is that the progression is treated as certain when it is merely conceivable. And the certainty, which makes the argument persuasive, is manufactured by the speed of the telling rather than by the evidence of the links. Think of a time someone argued against a small change by painting a picture of extreme consequences, and how the picture was vivid enough to make you afraid, and how the fear replaced the evaluation. You do not need to fear any slope tonight. Let the fallacy rest, sliding and imaginary, and know that most slippery slopes are dry, that the catastrophe at the bottom is almost always hypothetical, and that the argument works not by proving the fall is inevitable, but by making you too afraid to take the first step. The question that traps you either way. The question that traps you either way is the loaded question, the fallacy that embeds an assumption inside a question so that any answer you give accepts the assumption. Have you stopped cheating? If you say yes, you admit you were cheating. If you say no, you admit you are still cheating. The question does not allow a response that challenges the premise, and the person being questioned is trapped, forced to operate within a framework they did not agree to, defending themselves against an accusation that was smuggled in through the structure of the question rather than stated openly. Loaded questions are everywhere, in politics, in journalism, in everyday conversation. Used to force an answer that presupposes a fact the questioner wants established without having to prove it. Think of a time someone asked you a question that felt impossible to answer, and how the impossibility was not in the question's difficulty, but in its structure. The assumption baked into the phrasing, ensuring that any response confirmed something you did not want confirmed. You do not need to answer any loaded questions tonight. Let the trap rest, set and obvious now that you can see it, and know that the most dangerous questions are not the hardest ones, but the ones that have already decided the answer, hiding their conclusion inside their construction, and that the only honest response to a loaded question is not to answer it, but to challenge the load. It happened after. So it happened. It happened after. So it happened because. And this is post hoc ergo propter hoc, one of the most ancient and most persistent logical fallacies, the assumption that because one event followed another, the first event caused the second. I wore my lucky shirt and the team won. I took the supplement and my cold went away. The economy improved after the new president took office. In each case, the sequence is real, but the causation is assumed, and the assumption feels so natural that it takes deliberate effort to question it, because the brain is a story-making machine. And the simplest story it can tell about two events that happened in sequence is that the first one caused the second. The fallacy does not mean that sequence never indicates causation. Sometimes it does. The fallacy is in the assumption, the automatic leap from after to because without checking whether the connection is real. Think of a time you assumed one thing caused another simply because it came first, and how the assumption felt like common sense, and how common sense, in this case, was common fallacy. You do not need to trace any causes tonight. Let the sequence rest, and know that the brain's insistence on finding causes in sequences is one of its most useful and most misleading habits. Useful because causes often do follow their effects, and misleading because the following is not the same as the causing. The exception that disproves nothing is the anecdotal fallacy, the use of a personal story or a single example to dismiss a general truth. My grandfather smoked and lived to 90, therefore smoking is not harmful. The single case, because it is vivid and personal, carries more emotional weight than the statistical truth, and the weight, in the brain's accounting, is enough to outweigh data from thousands of cases. The fallacy works because the brain trusts stories more than statistics, a feature we discussed in the cognitive biases video, and the anecdote, because it has a face and a name, feels more real than the data, which has neither. The exception does not disprove the rule. It is the exception to it, and the existence of exceptions is what makes a statistical truth statistical rather than absolute. But the brain, offered a vivid exception, treats it as a refutation, and the statistical truth, which is more reliable, is quietly set aside in favor of the story, which is more compelling. Think of a general truth you dismissed because of a single counterexample, and how the example felt like proof when it was actually an outlier. You do not need to reevaluate anything tonight. Let the exceptions rest, vivid and unrepresentative, and know that the single story, however real, is not a rebuttal of the pattern, and the pattern, however boring, is more reliable than the story. Do it because everyone else does. Do it because everyone else does. And this is the bandwagon fallacy. The argument that something must be right, good, or true because many people believe it or do it. Millions of people use this product. Everyone agrees this is true. Nobody does it that way anymore. The number of believers is presented as evidence of the belief's validity, and the brain, which is wired for social proof, accepts the number as an argument, when in fact the number proves nothing about the truth of the claim, only about its popularity. Popular beliefs have been wrong throughout history, from the flat earth to phlogiston, to the conviction that ulcers were caused by stress. The popularity did not make them right, and the eventual correction did not require the majority to agree before the correction became valid. Think of a belief you hold because most people around you hold it, and whether you adopted it through independent evaluation or through the quiet gravitational pull of the majority. You do not need to leave any majority tonight. Let the bandwagon roll, and know that the comfort of agreement is not the same as the validity of the position, and that the brain's preference for the popular over the true is one of the oldest and most exploited fallacies in human reasoning, used by every person who has ever substituted a head count for an argument. The point that quietly moved. The point that quietly moved is the shifting goalpost fallacy, the strategy of changing the criteria for proof or success after the original criteria have been met, ensuring that the argument can never be won because the target is always moving. You asked for evidence and evidence was provided, and the response was, that is not enough evidence. You met the standard, and the standard was raised. You answered the question, and the question was changed. The goalposts shift because the person shifting them was never interested in the evidence. They were interested in maintaining their position, and the shifting ensures that no amount of evidence or achievement can ever be sufficient, because the definition of sufficient is always one step ahead of wherever you currently stand. Think of a time you met someone's standard and watched the standard change, and how the changing felt unfair, but was presented as reasonable, as though each new demand were a natural continuation of the original one. You do not need to meet any standard tonight. Let the goalposts rest wherever they landed last, and know that the shifting is not a sign of high standards, but of a fixed conclusion, a position that was never open to revision, defended not by evidence, but by the continuous redefinition of what evidence would be required to challenge it. The tricks that hide in plain speech. The tricks that hide in plain speech are the whole of this tier gathered into a single, quiet recognition that the everyday arguments you hear and make and accept are riddled with structural flaws that the brain does not detect, because the brain evaluates arguments by how they feel rather than how they function. Every fallacy tonight was a break in the logic that sounded like logic, a flaw that felt like a feature, a trick that hid in plain speech and operated by the simple mechanism of sounding right while being wrong. The ad hominem felt like a valid dismissal. The straw man felt like a fair rebuttal. The appeal to authority felt like evidence. The false dilemma felt like clarity. Each one worked because the brain's detection system is tuned to emotional coherence rather than logical validity. And the fallacies, which are emotionally coherent, pass through the filter as though they were logically sound. Think of how many arguments you accepted today without checking the logic, and how the accepting felt like thinking when it was actually trusting. The brain's quiet decision to believe rather than to evaluate. You do not need to check any logic tonight. Let the tricks rest, and know that the speech you hear every day is full of patterns that sound like reason and are not, and that tonight is about learning to hear the break beneath the sound. The distraction disguised as a point. The distraction disguised as a point is the red herring, one of the most effective and most frequently deployed fallacies in everyday argument. The strategy of introducing an irrelevant topic to divert attention from the original issue so that the original issue, quietly abandoned, is never addressed. The name comes from the practice of dragging a smoked fish across a trail to throw hounds off the scent. And the metaphor is exact because the red herring works by giving the mind a new scent to follow, one that feels relevant because it is interesting, even though it has no logical connection to the original point. The red herring does not refute the argument. It replaces it, offering a more compelling or more emotional topic that the audience follows instinctively, leaving the original point behind without anyone noticing that it was abandoned. Politicians are masters of the red herring, answering a question about policy with a story about a person, answering a challenge about numbers with an appeal to values, moving the conversation to a territory where they are strong, and leaving the territory where they are weak without ever being seen to leave. Think of the last time an argument shifted topic without anyone acknowledging the shift, and how the shift felt natural when it was actually strategic, the scent being redirected while the hounds followed willingly. You do not need to track any argument tonight. Let the red herring rest, effective and invisible, and know that the most common way to win an argument you are losing is not to answer the point, but to change it. And the changing, when done smoothly, is so natural that the audience forgets the original question was ever asked. The emotion that replaced the evidence. The emotion that replaced the evidence is the appeal to emotion, the fallacy of substituting an emotional response for a logical argument so that the audience's feelings, rather than their reasoning, determine whether the conclusion is accepted. The appeal to emotion does not argue that the conclusion is true. It makes you feel that the conclusion should be true. And the feeling, because it is stronger and faster than any rational evaluation, arrives before the logic can object. A vivid story replaces statistical evidence. A frightening image replaces a measured assessment. A heartwarming anecdote replaces a balanced analysis. In each case, the emotional content is doing the work that the evidence should be doing, and the work is being done more effectively because the brain processes emotion faster than reason and gives it more weight. The appeal to emotion is not always intentional. Many people genuinely believe they are making a logical argument when they are actually making an emotional one, because the emotion feels so much like evidence from the inside that the distinction disappears. Think of the last time you were persuaded by something that made you feel rather than something that made you think, and how the feeling arrived with the same authority as a fact, and how you accepted it with the same confidence. You do not need to separate any feeling from any fact tonight. Let the emotion rest, persuasive and possibly wrong, and know that the brain does not distinguish between a conclusion reached by evidence and a conclusion reached by feeling. And the not distinguishing is the exact crack through which the appeal to emotion enters. You did it too, so it must be fine. You did it too, so it must be fine. And this is the tu quoque fallacy, the strategy of deflecting criticism by pointing out that the critic has done the same thing, as though the critic's behavior changes the validity of the criticism. You say I should not lie, and the response is, but you lied last week. And the response, while factually true, has no bearing on whether lying is wrong. The critic's hypocrisy does not make the criticism false. It makes the critic inconsistent. But consistency is not a requirement for truth. And a true statement remains true regardless of who says it or what they have done. The tu quoque works because it shifts the focus from the argument to the arguer, a close cousin of the ad hominem, redirecting attention from whether the point is valid to whether the person making it has the moral standing to make it. The redirect is emotionally satisfying because exposing hypocrisy feels like winning, and the winning feeling masks the fact that the original point was never addressed. Think of the last time someone responded to your criticism by pointing out your own failures and how the pointing felt like a valid rebuttal when it was actually a change of subject. The original criticism left standing, unanswered, while you defended yourself instead. You do not need to defend any criticism tonight. Let the tu quoque rest, satisfying and irrelevant, and know that the messenger's sins do not change the message's truth. And the conflation of the two is one of the oldest and most effective ways to escape an argument you cannot win on its merits. Where it came from changes what you hear. Where it came from changes what you hear. And this is the genetic fallacy, the error of evaluating an argument based on its origin rather than its content. Accepting or rejecting a claim not because of the evidence, but because of where the claim came from. The idea came from a disreputable source, so it must be wrong. The idea came from a prestigious institution, so it must be right. The idea was popular in a terrible era, so it must be terrible. The idea was first proposed by someone you admire, so it must be admirable. The origin of an idea has no bearing on its validity, because a good idea can come from a bad source, and a bad idea can come from a good one. And the quality of the idea must be evaluated on its own terms, independent of its genealogy. The genetic fallacy works because the brain uses source as a shortcut for evaluation, trusting the origin when it should be testing the content. And the shortcut, while efficient, produces systematic errors in every direction. Think of an idea you dismissed because of where it came from, and whether the dismissal was a response to the idea or to the source, and how the source, negative or positive, colored the evaluation before the idea itself was ever examined. You do not need to reevaluate any origins tonight. Let the genetic fallacy rest, and know that the birth certificate of an idea tells you nothing about its truth, and that the ideas you have dismissed because of their origins may include some of the truest things you have ever refused to hear. The comparison that proves nothing. The comparison that proves nothing is the false analogy. The use of a comparison between two things that are similar in some ways, but different in the ways that matter. To argue that a conclusion true of one must be true of the other. Running a country is like running a business. Raising a child is like training a dog. Building a career is like climbing a mountain. The analogies are vivid, compelling, and wrong because the similarities they highlight are surface level, while the differences they obscure are fundamental. And the conclusion drawn from the comparison depends on the similarities being deep enough to support it, which they almost never are. The false analogy works because the brain loves comparisons, because analogy is one of the primary ways the mind processes new information, mapping the unfamiliar onto the familiar, and the mapping, because it feels like understanding, disguises the gap between the two things being compared. Think of an analogy that convinced you and ask whether the two things being compared are truly similar in the way the analogy requires, or whether the comparison highlighted the similarities and quietly buried the differences. You do not need to deconstruct any analogy tonight. Let the comparison rest, vivid and incomplete, and know that the analogy, for all its explanatory power, is one of the most unreliable forms of argument, because the similarities that make it compelling are almost never the same as the similarities that would make it valid. The tradition that became the truth. The tradition that became the truth is the appeal to tradition, the fallacy of arguing that something is right, good, or true because it has always been done that way. The argument does not defend the practice on its merits. It defends it on its duration, treating the length of time something has existed as evidence of its value, as though the mere fact of persistence proves the thing is worth persisting. We have always done it this way. This is how it has always been. The old ways are the best ways. Each statement treats duration as argument, when duration proves nothing about quality, only about inertia. The tendency of established practices to continue because changing them requires more effort than maintaining them. Slavery persisted for millennia. That did not make it right. Bloodletting persisted for centuries. That did not make it effective. The persistence of a practice proves it was persistent, nothing more. Think of a practice in your own life that you maintain because it has always been that way, and whether the always was ever a good reason or simply the absence of a better one. You do not need to question any tradition tonight. Let the old ways rest, and know that the appeal to tradition is one of the quietest and most powerful fallacies, because it wraps the inertia of habit in the language of wisdom, and the wrapping, because it feels like respect for the past, disguises the fact that no one ever actually evaluated whether the past deserved the respect. The novelty that became the proof. The novelty that became the proof is the appeal to novelty, the mirror image of the appeal to tradition, the fallacy of arguing that something is better, more correct, or more valuable simply because it is new. The new method must be superior. The latest research must be right. The modern approach must be better than the old one. The argument treats newness as evidence of quality, as though the mere fact of being recent proves the thing as an improvement, when in fact newness proves nothing about quality, only about timing. New ideas can be worse than old ones. New methods can be less effective than traditional ones. New research can be wrong. The appeal to novelty works because the culture has a bias toward progress, the assumption that newer is better, that the arc of development bends toward improvement, and the assumption, while sometimes true, is not always true. And the not always is the crack through which the fallacy enters. Think of a time you chose the new over the old simply because it was new, and whether the choosing was based on an evaluation of quality or on the seduction of novelty. You do not need to evaluate anything tonight. Let the new rest beside the old, and know that the age of an idea, old or new, tells you nothing about its truth, and that the best idea is the true one, regardless of when it was born. The threat that replaced the argument. The fallacy of using threats, intimidation, or the implication of negative consequences to compel agreement rather than earning it through evidence and logic. You had better agree or else. If you do not accept this, bad things will happen. The consequences of disagreeing are too severe to risk. The threat does not prove the conclusion is true. It proves the person making it has power, and the power, used as a substitute for logic, produces compliance that looks like agreement, but is actually submission. The appeal to force is not always physical. It can be social, the threat of ostracism, of being labeled, of losing status, of being excluded from the group. And the social version, because it is subtler, is often more effective than the physical one, producing agreement that the person giving it genuinely believes is voluntary. Think of a time you agreed with something because the cost of disagreeing was too high, and how the agreeing felt like a choice when it was actually a calculation, the mind weighing the consequences rather than the evidence. You do not need to stand against any threat tonight. Let the pressure rest and know that agreement produced by threat is not agreement at all, but compliance. And the compliance, because it was never based on evidence, will dissolve the moment the threat is removed. The flattery that's smuggled in the point. The flattery that's smuggled in the point is the appeal to flattery, the strategy of complimenting the audience before presenting the argument, so that the audience's positive feeling about themselves transfers to the argument being made. You are too smart to fall for their claims. A person of your sophistication understands. Someone as educated as you can see that. The flattery creates a warm feeling, and the warm feeling, still active when the argument arrives, makes the argument feel more acceptable, not because the argument is better, but because the person hearing it feels better. The mechanism is simple. The compliment produces a positive emotional state, and the positive state, as we discussed with cognitive biases, reduces critical thinking, making the person more accepting, more trusting, and less likely to evaluate the argument carefully. The flattery is the spoonful of sugar that makes the argument go down, and the argument, sweetened by the compliment, is swallowed without the chewing it would have received in a neutral state. Think of a time someone complimented you before asking you for something, and how the compliment made the asking easier to accept. You do not need to guard against any flattery tonight. Let the compliment rest, warm and strategic, and know that the person who flatters you before arguing is not being kind. They are being tactical, using your own self-regard as a tool for your own persuasion. The repetition that became the fact. The repetition that became the fact is the argumentum ad nauseam, the fallacy of repeating a claim so many times that it begins to feel true, not because evidence supports it, but because familiarity, produced by repetition, is processed by the brain as truth. The first time you hear a claim, you evaluate it. The 10th time, you recognize it. The 100th time, you know it. And the knowing, which feels like the product of evidence, is actually the product of exposure. Psychologists call this the illusory truth effect, the documented finding that repeated exposure to a statement increases the likelihood of believing it, regardless of its actual truth value. Propagandists have understood this for centuries, knowing that a lie repeated often enough becomes, in the mind of the listener, indistinguishable from the truth. Think of a claim you believe to be true, and ask how many times you heard it before you believed it, and whether the believing was a product of evaluation or of repetition, and how the repetition, by the 100th hearing, had transformed the claim from something you heard into something you knew. You do not need to examine any repeated claim tonight. Let the repetition rest, and know that the brain's equation of familiarity with truth is one of the most exploited features of human cognition, and that many of the things you know are things you were simply told often enough that the telling became the knowing. The middle ground that is not always right. The middle ground that is not always right is the argument to moderation, the fallacy of assuming that the truth must lie between two extreme positions simply because they are extreme, that the compromise position is automatically the correct one. One person says the earth is round, another says it is flat. The middle ground would say it is slightly curved, and the middle ground would be wrong. because the truth is not obligated to occupy the center of every debate. The argument to moderation feels wise because it feels balanced, and balance, in the brain's accounting, is associated with fairness and reason. And the association, pleasant and comfortable, disguises the fact that balance is a social virtue, not a logical one. And the balanced position can be just as wrong as either extreme. Think of a debate in which you assume the truth must be somewhere in the middle, and consider that the assumption was based not on evidence, but on the feeling that the middle is a safer, more reasonable place to stand, and how the safety of the middle may have nothing to do with the truth of the middle. You do not need to pick any side tonight. Let the middle rest, comfortable and possibly wrong, and know that the truth does not care about your comfort. And the middle ground, which feels like wisdom, is sometimes just the average of two positions, one of which was right all along. The complexity they use to confuse you. The complexity they use to confuse you is the fallacy of obscurantism, the use of deliberately complex, technical, or incomprehensible language to make an argument seem more sophisticated and therefore more likely to be true, when the complexity is actually hiding the absence of a valid point. The argument sounds impressive. The words are large, the sentences are long, the concepts are layered, and the audience, unable to follow the complexity, assumes the failure is theirs, that the argument must be valid because they cannot find the flaw, when in fact the complexity was designed to prevent them from finding it. The fallacy exploits the brain's association between complexity and intelligence, the assumption that if something is hard to understand, it must be profound, when in reality, the clearest sign of genuine understanding is the ability to explain something simply, and the inability or refusal to explain simply is often a sign not of depth, but of emptiness, dressed in long words. Think of a time someone's argument confused you and you assume they must be right because you could not follow, and consider that the not following was the strategy, the confusion doing the work that the evidence could not. You do not need to decode any complexity tonight. Let the long words rest and know that the argument that cannot be stated simply may be an argument that does not exist, and the simplicity you crave is not a sign of shallow thinking, but of clear thinking. The wins that need no logic at all. The wins that need no logic at all are the whole of this tier gathered into a single, unsettling recognition that the arguments that persuade you most effectively in everyday life are almost never the ones with the strongest logic. They are the ones with the strongest emotional pull, the most effective distraction, the most skillful flattery, the most persistent repetition, and the most intimidating delivery. The fallacies in this tier do not argue. They perform, using every tool except valid reasoning to produce a conclusion that feels earned, but was actually installed, placed in your mind not by evidence, but by technique. The red herring distracted you. The emotion replaced your evidence. The tu quoque deflected your criticism. The false analogy painted a picture that was not quite accurate. The tradition and the novelty each used time as proof. The repetition wore you down. And the wins, accumulated over a lifetime of being persuaded by technique rather than truth, have shaped your beliefs, your values, and your reality in ways you have never examined. Think of how many of your beliefs were installed by persuasion rather than proof, and how the installation was so smooth you could not feel it happening. You do not need to re-examine any belief tonight. Let the wins rest, logic-free and deeply held, and know that the most effective persuasion has never needed logic, and that the absence of logic, far from weakening an argument, often makes it stronger, because the brain, which prefers feeling to thinking, finds the logic-free argument more convincing, precisely because it asks nothing of the mind except surrender. The argument that proves itself. The argument that proves itself is circular reasoning, the fallacy of using the conclusion of an argument as one of its premises, so that the argument appears to prove something, but is actually assuming the very thing it claims to demonstrate. The Bible is true because it is the Word of God, and we know it is the Word of God because the Bible says so. The reasoning moves in a circle, each point supporting the next. The chain of logic forming a loop that never touches ground, never connects to anything outside itself, and never provides the independent evidence that a valid argument requires. The circularity is often hidden, disguised by elaboration, by long chains of reasoning that make the loop large enough to forget that the ending returns to the beginning. But the structure, however ornate, is always the same. The conclusion smuggled into the premise, the argument lifting itself by its own straps, proving nothing while appearing to prove everything. Circular reasoning feels convincing because the chain of logic is internally consistent, each step following naturally from the last, and the consistency feels like validity, when it is actually just a circle, self-supporting and self-contained, disconnected from any external verification. Think of a belief you hold that, when you trace its justification, eventually returns to the belief itself, the chain of reasons looping back to the starting point without ever touching independent ground. You do not need to trace any loops tonight. Let the circle rest, closed and convincing, and know that the argument that seems to prove itself is almost always the argument that has assumed itself, and the assuming, dressed as proving, is one of the oldest and most invisible fallacies in human reasoning. The conclusion hidden in the premise. The conclusion hidden in the premise is begging the question, the fallacy of embedding the conclusion inside the setup so that the argument, rather than establishing the conclusion, merely restates it in different words. Abortion is wrong because killing the unborn is immoral. Free will must exist because humans have the ability to choose freely. The conclusion is not proven. It is rephrased, placed in the premise as an assumption rather than presented as a conclusion that needs supporting. And the rephrasing, because it uses different words, disguises the circularity. The fallacy is difficult to detect because the premise and the conclusion, while logically identical, are linguistically different. And the brain, which processes language rather than logic, treats the different words as different claims, missing the fact that the same proposition is being stated twice. Think of an argument you found convincing and ask whether the conclusion was actually demonstrated or merely reworded, whether the premise said anything independent of the conclusion or just said the same thing in more elaborate language. You do not need to unpack any argument tonight. Let the hidden conclusion rest, embedded and invisible, and know that begging the question is one of the most common fallacies in everyday reasoning, so common that the phrase itself has lost its original meaning. And the fallacy it names, the smuggling of conclusions into premises, continues to operate everywhere, undetected and unchallenged, precisely because it is so difficult to see. One example, and you built a rule. One example, and you built a rule, and this is the hasty generalization, one of the most natural and most unreliable forms of human reasoning. The tendency to observe a single instance or a small number of instances and build a general rule from them, treating the limited sample as though it represented the entire category. You met one rude person from a country and decided the whole country is rude. You had one bad experience with a brand and decided all their products are bad. You saw one failure and concluded the entire approach is flawed. The generalization feels like learning, like wisdom gained from experience, like the practical intelligence that keeps you from repeating mistakes. But the generalization, built from too few examples, is almost always wrong, because the world is more varied than any small sample can capture, and the rule you built from the sample does not describe the world. It describes the sample, and the sample, being small, is not the world. Think of a rule you carry about a category of people, of places, of experiences, and ask how many examples the rule is based on, and whether the number is large enough to justify the rule, or so small that the rule is, in truth, a story told from insufficient evidence. You do not need to revise any generalization tonight. Let the rules rest, hasty and confident, and know that the brain builds rules from one example, because building rules is what the brain does, and the building, while fast and useful, produces rules that are often as wrong as the single example they were built from. What is true of the part is not the whole. What is true of the part is not the whole. And this is the fallacy of composition, the error of assuming that what is true of each individual part must also be true of the whole that the parts compose. Every player on the team is excellent. Therefore, the team must be excellent. Every ingredient is delicious. Therefore, the dish must be delicious. The logic seems sound because it feels intuitive, because you expect the qualities of the parts to transfer to the whole, but the whole is more than the sum of its parts, and the additional factor, the way the parts interact, the way they combine, the emergent properties that arise from the combination, can make the whole completely different from what the parts would predict. A team of excellent individuals can be a terrible team if the individuals do not work well together. Delicious ingredients can produce a terrible dish if the combination is wrong. The whole has properties that the parts do not have, and the assumption that the parts' qualities transfer upward is a structural error in reasoning that produces wrong conclusions from true premises. Think of a time you assumed a group would be as good as its members, or a project would be as easy as its steps, and how the assumption failed because the whole behaved differently from what the parts predicted. You do not need to compose anything tonight. Let the parts rest, excellent and misleading, and know that the qualities of the pieces do not automatically become the qualities of the whole. What is true of the whole is not each part. What is true of the whole is not each part, and this is the fallacy of division, the mirror image of composition, the error of assuming that what is true of the whole must be true of each individual part. The country is wealthy, therefore each citizen must be wealthy. The team won, therefore each player played well. The company is successful, therefore each department must be effective. The logic is the same structural error in reverse, the assumption that the whole's properties transfer downward to the parts, when the parts may have properties completely different from the whole they compose. A wealthy country can contain millions of poor citizens. A winning team can include players who perform terribly. A successful company can house departments that are failing. The whole's qualities are emergent, arising from the interaction of the parts, and the parts, taken individually, may have none of the qualities the whole displays. Think of a time you assumed something about an individual based on the group they belong to, and how the assumption treated the individual as a representative of the group's average when they were actually their own specific case. You do not need to divide anything tonight. Let the whole rest, impressive and unrepresentative, and know that the person standing in front of you is not a sample of their group, but a specific, particular, unreducible individual. And the group's qualities, however real, may have nothing to do with theirs. The cause you invented from a connection. The cause you invented from a connection is the confusion of correlation with causation, one of the most persistent and most consequential errors in human reasoning. The assumption that because two things occur together, one must be causing the other. Ice cream sales and drowning rates both increase in summer. The brain, noting the correlation, wants to draw a causal arrow, Ice cream causes drowning, or drowning causes ice cream, when in fact both are caused by a third factor, hot weather, and the correlation between them, while real, reflects no causal relationship whatsoever. The error is everywhere. Countries with more television sets have higher rates of heart disease, not because television causes heart disease, but because both correlate with wealth. Students who eat breakfast perform better in school, not necessarily because breakfast improves performance, but possibly because the kind of household that serves breakfast provides other advantages as well. The correlation is real. The cause is invented, manufactured by a brain that cannot observe two things moving together without assuming one is pushing the other. Think of a causal belief you hold and ask whether the belief is based on demonstrated causation or observed correlation, and how confident you are about the distinction. You do not need to trace any causes tonight. Let the connections rest, correlated and non-causal, and know that the brain's eagerness to find causes in correlations is one of its most productive and most misleading habits. The explanation that explains too much. The explanation that explains too much is the unfalsifiable claim, the argument that is constructed so broadly that no possible evidence could disprove it, and that therefore, despite its apparent explanatory power, explains nothing. If the treatment works, it proves the treatment is effective. If the treatment does not work, the patient did not believe hard enough. If the prediction comes true, the theory is confirmed. If the prediction does not come true, there were interfering factors. The explanation accommodates every possible outcome, which means it predicts none of them, and a theory that predicts nothing tests nothing, and a theory that tests nothing proves nothing. The unfalsifiable claim feels powerful because it is never wrong, but the never being wrong is exactly what makes it empty, because a claim that cannot be wrong cannot be informative. And the information content of a proposition is measured by what it excludes, not by what it includes. Think of a belief you hold that seems to be confirmed by everything and refuted by nothing. And consider that the all-confirming quality is not a strength, but a weakness. The sign that the belief has been constructed to survive any evidence rather than to illuminate any truth. You do not need to test any belief tonight. Let the unfalsifiable rest, invulnerable and empty, and know that the explanation that explains everything explains nothing, and the nothing, dressed in the everything, is one of the hardest fallacies to see. The question you should have asked first. The question you should have asked first is the question that challenges the premise of the argument rather than engaging with the conclusion. The question that steps back from the debate and asks whether the debate itself is based on a valid foundation. Most arguments proceed from a premise that is assumed rather than established, and the failure to question the premise means that every conclusion built on it, however logically valid, is built on an unverified base. The argument may be perfectly logical from premise to conclusion, but if the premise is wrong, the conclusion is wrong, and the perfect logic connecting them only makes the wrongness more convincing. Think of a debate you have been part of, and ask whether anyone questioned the premise or whether everyone accepted it and argued only about the conclusion, and how different the debate would have been if someone had stepped back and said, "Wait, is the starting point even true?" You do not need to question any premises tonight. Let the foundations rest, assumed and unexamined, and know that the most powerful move in any argument is not to attack the conclusion, but to question the premise, because the premise, if it falls, takes every conclusion built upon it down with it. The absence of proof is not proof, and this is the appeal to ignorance, the fallacy of arguing that because something has not been proven false, it must be true. or because it has not been proven true, it must be false. No one has proven ghosts do not exist, therefore ghosts exist. No one has proven the treatment works, therefore the treatment does not work. The absence of evidence is treated as evidence of absence, or the absence of disproof is treated as proof, and both moves are structurally identical errors, the gap in knowledge being filled not with investigation but with assumption. The appeal to ignorance exploits the brain's discomfort with uncertainty, the need to fill every gap with a conclusion, and the filling, because it resolves the discomfort, feels like thinking, when it is actually the avoidance of thinking. The honest response to the absence of proof is not to conclude, but to wait, to hold the uncertainty without filling it. And the holding, while uncomfortable, is the only intellectually honest position available when the evidence is insufficient. Think of a belief you hold because no one has disproved it, and consider that the not disproving is not the same as the proving. You do not need to prove anything tonight. Let the gaps rest, unfilled and honest, and know that the absence of evidence is not a conclusion. It is a question, still open, still waiting, still unanswered. The burden you placed on the wrong side. The burden you placed on the wrong side is the shifting of the burden of proof, the fallacy of demanding that the person questioning a claim prove it false rather than requiring the person making the claim to prove it true. The person making an extraordinary claim says, "Prove me wrong," rather than presenting evidence for their position. And the shifting, which reverses the natural order of argumentation, places an impossible burden on the questioner, because proving a negative is almost always harder than proving a positive. And the difficulty of the task makes the claim seem more credible, simply because it has not been disproved. The burden of proof belongs to the person making the claim, not to the person questioning it. And the shifting of this burden is one of the most common and most effective rhetorical tricks used by everyone who has ever made a claim they could not support and demanded that others do the work of refuting it. Think of a time someone said, "Prove me wrong," instead of presenting their evidence, and how the demand felt reasonable when it was actually a reversal, the claimant outsourcing the work to the questioner. You do not need to carry any burden tonight. Let the proof rest on whichever side it currently sits, and know that the person who says, "Prove me wrong," is almost always the person who cannot prove themselves right. And the inability, disguised as a challenge, is the surest sign that the claim has no legs to stand on. You picked the data that fit your answer. You picked the data that fit your answer, and this is cherry picking. The fallacy of selecting only the evidence that supports your conclusion while ignoring the evidence that contradicts it, producing an argument that looks well supported while being fundamentally dishonest. The cherry picker does not lie about the evidence they present. Every piece is real. Every data point is accurate. The dishonesty is in the selection, in the choosing of the confirming evidence and the omitting of the disconfirming evidence. And the result is a picture that is technically made of true pieces, but that is, as a whole, false, because the true pieces were chosen to tell a particular story, and the pieces that would have told a different story were left out. Cherry picking is devastating because it is invisible. The audience sees real evidence, real data, real examples, and has no way of knowing what was left out, because the left-out evidence is, by definition, absent. Think of a time you built an argument by selecting only the evidence that supported it, and how natural the selecting felt, and how the naturalness was the bias at work. You do not need to select anything tonight. Let the evidence rest, picked and unpicked, and know that cherry-picking is not the presentation of false evidence, but the concealment of true evidence. And the concealment, because it leaves only the confirming pieces visible, produces a picture that is made entirely of truth and is, nonetheless, completely misleading. The rule you applied where it does not belong is the fallacy of the wrong category. The error of taking a principle that is valid in one domain and applying it in a domain where it does not hold. What works in business does not always work in family. What works in science does not always work in ethics. What works in war does not always work in peace. The rule is not wrong. It is misapplied, taken from the context where it was developed, and placed in a context where the conditions are different, and the different conditions produce a different result. One the rule did not predict, because the rule was never designed for this territory. The fallacy exploits the brain's preference for general rules, the desire to find one principle that works everywhere. And the desire, while understandable, produces systematic errors when it extends a local truth into a universal one. Think of a rule you apply across different areas of your life and ask whether the rule was developed for all of them or just one, and whether the applying feels like wisdom or like habit. You do not need to restrict any rule tonight. Let the principles rest, valid and misplaced, and know that the most useful rule in the world becomes the most dangerous when it is applied where it does not belong. The traps your own thinking sets for you. The traps your own thinking sets for you are the whole of this tier gathered into a single, humbling recognition that the errors in this section were not performed on you by others. They were performed by you, on yourself, by the normal, automatic, everyday process of reasoning that your brain carries out every waking moment. You reasoned in circles. You generalized from one example. You confused the part with the whole. You invented causes from correlations. You built unfalsifiable explanations. You cherry-picked your evidence. And every one of these errors felt, from the inside, exactly like good thinking, because the brain does not announce its errors. It presents them as conclusions, wrapping broken logic in the feeling of insight. And the feeling, because it is the same feeling that accompanies genuine insight, is indistinguishable from it. Think of how many of the traps in this tier are traps you have fallen into, not occasionally but regularly, and how the falling felt like thinking every single time. You do not need to check any reasoning tonight. Let the traps rest, set and familiar, and know that the most dangerous fallacies are not the ones used against you by others, but the ones your own mind produces, automatically, invisibly, and with a confidence that makes them almost impossible to detect from the inside. The luck that was never due. The luck that was never due is the gambler's fallacy, one of the most intuitive and most wrong beliefs about probability. The conviction that after a streak of one outcome, the opposite outcome becomes more likely, as though the universe were keeping score and had decided it was time to balance the ledger. The coin has landed heads 5 times. The next flip must be tails. The slot machine has not paid out in hours. It is due. The team has lost 4 in a row. They must be due for a win. The feeling is powerful, almost physical, the sense that the odds are shifting, that probability is accumulating pressure toward the other outcome, that fairness itself demands the correction. But probability does not keep score. Each flip is independent. Each spin is independent. The previous outcomes have no effect on the next one, and the feeling that they do, the feeling that the universe owes you a correction, is entirely manufactured by a brain that cannot accept randomness and insists on finding patterns where the math says there are none. Think of a time you felt something was due, and how the feeling of inevitability was so strong it felt like knowledge, and how the knowledge was wrong because the odds had not shifted. They never do. You do not need to gamble on anything tonight. Let the luck rest, unowed and unpredictable, and know that the universe does not keep a ledger, does not remember the last flip, and does not owe you anything. And the feeling that it does is one of the most persistent and most costly fallacies the human brain produces. The average that hid the truth. The average that hid the truth is one of the most quietly deceptive uses of numbers. The presentation of a single average figure that conceals enormous variation underneath. The average salary in a company is $100,000. This sounds like everyone earns a comfortable living, but if the CEO earns $1 million and the rest earn $50,000, the average is technically correct and practically meaningless, because the number that represents the center does not represent anyone in the actual distribution. The average is not a lie. It is a compression, a single number standing in for a complex distribution. And the compression, while useful in some contexts, is misleading in every context where the distribution is uneven, which is most of them. Incomes are uneven. Test scores are uneven. Heights, weights, lifespans, all unevenly distributed. And the average, applied to any of them, smooths out the very variation that matters most. Think of a time you heard an average and felt informed, and consider what the average might have been hiding: the extremes at both ends, the variation in the middle, the actual shape of the reality. The single number was compressing into one tidy figure. You do not need to decompress any number tonight. Let the average rest, tidy and incomplete, and know that the average is not a description of reality, but a simplification of it. And the simplification, while convenient, often hides more truth than it reveals. You ignored the base rate. You ignored the base rate, and this is the base rate fallacy. One of the most consequential errors in everyday reasoning about risk. The tendency to focus on the specific, vivid, individual case, while ignoring the background probability that gives the case its actual significance. A medical test is 99% accurate. You test positive. You panic. But if the disease affects only 1 in 10,000 people, the odds that you actually have the disease, despite the positive test, may be less than 1%, because the base rate, the background frequency of the condition, overwhelms the test's accuracy. The math is counterintuitive, and the brain, which processes vivid individual cases far more effectively than abstract probabilities, almost always gets it wrong, overweighting the specific result and underweighting the background rate that gives the result its meaning. Doctors make this error. Judges make this error. Scientists make this error. The base rate is invisible because it is abstract, and the specific case is compelling because it is personal. And the mismatch between the two produces systematically wrong assessments of probability in every domain where base rates are relevant, which is nearly every domain. Think of a risk you assessed without considering the background probability, and how different the assessment would look if the base rate were included. You do not need to recalculate any risk tonight. Let the base rates rest, ignored and essential, and know that the number you did not consider is almost always more important than the number you did. The sample that represented nothing is the fallacy of the unrepresentative sample, the error of drawing conclusions about a population from a group that does not adequately represent it. You surveyed your friends and concluded that most people agree with you. You read the comments and concluded that the audience is angry. You looked at the people around you and concluded that the world is a certain way. In each case, the sample, the group you observed, was not the population, the larger group you drew conclusions about, and the gap between the two, filled by the assumption that the sample represents the population, is where the fallacy lives. The sample is biased by who is available, who is willing, who is visible. And the bias, because it is invisible, makes the conclusions feel representative when they are actually parochial, drawn from a group that looks like a slice of the world, but is actually a slice of your access to the world. Think of a conclusion you drew about the world based on the people you see, and how the people you see are a specific, non-random, deeply biased sample of the people who exist. You do not need to sample anything tonight. Let the unrepresentative rest, confident and narrow, and know that the world you have concluded exists may be a description not of the world, but of the sample you happen to observe, and the sample, no matter how large it felt, was never the world. The target drawn after the shot. The target drawn after the shot is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, named for the joke about a shooter who fires randomly at a barn and then paints the bullseye around the tightest cluster of holes, presenting randomness as precision. The fallacy occurs whenever someone looks at random data, finds a cluster, and declares the cluster significant, without acknowledging that in any random data set, clusters will appear by chance, and the finding of a cluster after the fact, rather than the prediction of it before, is meaningless. The pattern is real. The significance is invented. And the invention, because it starts from a genuine observation, feels like a discovery when it is actually an imposition. The mind drawing the target after the shot and calling it accuracy. Think of a time you noticed a pattern in data and felt certain it meant something. And consider that the pattern may have been one of the many random clusters that any data set produces. Noticed because your brain was looking for patterns, and declared significant because your brain needs patterns to mean something. You do not need to evaluate any patterns tonight. Let the clusters rest, random and meaningful looking, and know that the brain is a target drawer, always painting the bullseye around whatever cluster it finds. And the painting, because it starts from real data, produces a discovery that is built on randomness and dressed in significance. The percentage that meant two things. The percentage that meant two things is the confusion between relative and absolute numbers, one of the most commonly exploited fallacies in health, finance, and public policy. A new drug reduces your risk of heart attack by 50%. This sounds enormous, but if your baseline risk is 2 in 1,000, a 50% reduction brings it to 1 in 1,000, an absolute reduction of 1/10 of 1%. The relative number, 50%, is dramatic. The absolute number, 1 in 1,000, is tiny. Both are true. Both describe the same data. And the choice of which one to present determines whether you are impressed or unmoved. Not because the data changed, but because the frame changed. And the frame, as we discussed with the framing effect, is doing more work than the data. Pharmaceutical companies present relative risk reductions because they sound large. Public health officials present absolute risk reductions when they want to calm the public. The data is the same. The impression is completely different. Think of a percentage that impressed you and ask whether it was a relative or absolute figure, and how different the same data would have looked in the other format. You do not need to recalculate anything tonight. Let the percentages rest, dual and deceptive, and know that the same number can mean two very different things depending on whether it is presented in relative or absolute terms, and the choosing of the presentation is almost never neutral. The graph that lied without lying. The graph that lied without lying is the visual manipulation of data through the design of the graph itself, the selection of axes, scales, colors, and time frames that make the data say what the presenter wants it to say without changing a single number. A graph that starts its y-axis at 90 instead of 0 makes a small change look enormous. A graph that compresses the x-axis makes a rapid change look gradual. A graph that uses a logarithmic scale makes exponential growth look linear. In each case, the data is accurate, the numbers are real, and the picture is misleading designed to produce an impression that the raw numbers, presented plainly, would not support. The graph is one of the most trusted forms of communication because it feels objective, visual, direct, as though the data were speaking for itself, when in fact the data is speaking through a design that was chosen to make it say a particular thing. Think of a graph that convinced you and ask what design choices shaped the impression, whether the axes were honest, whether the scale was proportional, whether the time frame was representative. You do not need to redesign any graph tonight. Let the visuals rest, accurate and misleading, and know that the graph that lied without lying is the most effective kind of lie, the one that uses real data to produce a false impression. And the impression, because it came from a graph, carries the authority of objectivity while serving the purpose of persuasion. The trend that was just noise. The trend that was just noise is the error of seeing a meaningful direction in random fluctuation, of treating normal variation as though it were a signal, and of drawing conclusions about the future from data that is, statistically, saying nothing at all. Sales went up last month. The trend is positive. Crime went down this quarter. The policy is working. Your symptoms improved today. The treatment is effective. In each case, the change may be real, but within the range of normal variation, the random noise that any data set produces regardless of any underlying trend. And the brain, which cannot distinguish between signal and noise from the inside, treats the noise as signal and builds conclusions on randomness. The error is not in noticing the change. It is in interpreting the change as meaningful when the change is within the range of what randomness alone would produce. Think of a change you interpreted as a trend and acted upon, and consider that the change may have been noise, the random movement of a system that has no trend, and the trend you saw was painted on the noise by a brain that cannot look at data without finding a story. You do not need to find any trend tonight. Let the noise rest, random and story-shaped, and know that most of the short-term changes that feel meaningful are fluctuations that a statistician would call noise, and the stories you build on them are stories built on sand. The big number that meant nothing. The big number that meant nothing is the error of being impressed by a number's size without considering its context, of treating magnitude as significance, of assuming that a large number must be important simply because it is large. 1 million people signed the petition. This sounds decisive, but in a country of 300 million, it is less than 0.5%. The company lost $10 million. This sounds catastrophic, but if the company's revenue is 10 billion, the loss is a rounding error. The number is real. The impression it produces is disproportionate because the brain processes the number in isolation, without the denominator, without the context, without the comparison that would give the number its actual meaning. Big numbers feel significant because bigness itself triggers an emotional response, the same awe response that large physical things trigger. And the awe, applied to numbers, produces a respect for magnitude that has nothing to do with proportion. Think of a large number that impressed you and ask what the denominator was, what the number was large relative to, and how the impression would change if the context were provided. You do not need to contextualize anything tonight. Let the big numbers rest, impressive and possibly meaningless, and know that a number without a context is a word without a sentence, technically present and practically uninformative. The risk you measured wrong. The risk you measured wrong is the neglect of probability in favor of severity. The tendency to evaluate a risk based on how bad the outcome would be, rather than on how likely the outcome is, producing a risk assessment that is driven by fear rather than by math. You fear the plane crash more than the car crash, even though you are statistically far more likely to die in a car. Because the plane crash is more vivid, more catastrophic, more terrible to imagine, and the imagining is what the brain uses to estimate risk, not the probability. The vivid, severe outcome dominates the assessment, and the probable, mundane outcome is ignored, producing a systematic overestimation of dramatic risks and a systematic underestimation of ordinary ones. The result is a world in which people fear the wrong things, avoiding the rare, spectacular danger while walking into the common, unremarkable one without concern. Think of the risk you fear most and compare it to the risk that is statistically most dangerous to you, and how different the two are, and how the difference is produced entirely by the brain's preference for vividness over probability. You do not need to reassess any risk tonight. Let the fears rest, disproportionate and vivid, and know that the risk you fear most is almost never the risk most likely to harm you, and the risk most likely to harm you is almost always the one you never think about. The survivors told you a false story. The survivors told you a false story, and this is survivorship bias applied to data. The systematic error of studying only the data that survived and drawing conclusions that ignore the data that did not. The buildings that are still standing look well built, but you cannot see the buildings that fell down. The companies that succeeded look like they followed a formula, but you cannot see the companies that followed the same formula and failed. The people who recovered from the disease look like the treatment worked, but you cannot see the people who took the same treatment and did not recover. The visible data is the surviving data, and the surviving data, by definition, is not representative of the whole, because the whole includes everything that did not survive, and the not surviving, being invisible, is excluded from the analysis. Think of a success story that inspired you and ask how many identical stories ended in failure, and how the failures, being invisible, were excluded from the narrative that convinced you that the method works. You do not need to account for any survivors tonight. Let the stories rest, visible and incomplete, and know that the data you can see is always a biased sample of the data that exists, biased by the simple fact that the unsuccessful, the failed, and the dead are not available to tell their side. The numbers that trick you every day. The numbers that trick you every day are the whole of this tier gathered into a single, humbling recognition that the data you encounter, the statistics you read, the numbers you are presented with, are almost never as straightforward as they appear. The average hides the distribution. The percentage hides the base rate. The graph hides the design. The trend hides the noise. The big number hides the context. And the brain, which processes numbers less effectively than it processes stories, takes the numbers at face value, trusting the precision of the figure without questioning the frame, the sample, the context, or the choice that determined which number was shown and which was hidden. Think of how much of your understanding of the world is built on numbers you did not question, statistics you did not decompose, percentages you did not convert, and how the not questioning felt like trust when it was actually the absence of the scrutiny the numbers deserved. You do not need to scrutinize any number tonight. Let the data rest, tricky and trusted, and know that the numbers, which feel like the most objective form of truth available, are one of the most easily manipulated, not by changing them, but by choosing which ones to show, how to frame them, and what context to withhold. And the withholding, invisible and deliberate, is the space where the numbers do their most effective lying. Natural does not mean good. Natural does not mean good, and this is the appeal to nature, one of the most deeply intuitive and most logically broken fallacies in everyday reasoning. The assumption that whatever is natural is automatically healthier, safer, more moral, or more correct than whatever is artificial. Natural ingredients must be better than synthetic ones. Natural behaviors must be more acceptable than learned ones. Natural remedies must be safer than manufactured ones. The word natural carries an emotional warmth that artificial does not, and the warmth, which feels like evidence, is doing the argumentative work that actual evidence should be doing. But nature is not benevolent. Arsenic is natural. Earthquakes are natural. Smallpox is natural. The naturalness of a thing tells you nothing about its value, its safety, or its desirability. Because nature produces beauty and catastrophe with equal indifference, and the selection of only the beautiful as representative of nature is itself a form of cherry-picking. Think of a time you chose something because it was natural, and whether the choosing was based on an evaluation of the thing or on the feeling the word natural produced, and how the feeling, warm and reassuring, replaced the evaluation you should have done. You do not need to evaluate anything tonight. Let the natural rest beside the artificial, and know that the appeal to nature is one of the most commercially exploited fallacies in the modern world, selling everything from food to philosophy on the basis of a word that means nothing about quality and everything about feeling. The world is not fair and never was. The world is not fair and never was, and this is the just world fallacy applied to reasoning. The deeply held, mostly unconscious belief that people get what they deserve, that outcomes reflect merit, that the universe distributes its rewards and punishments according to a moral logic that ensures the good are rewarded and the bad are punished. The belief feels like common sense because it is comforting, because the alternative, that outcomes are often random, undeserved, and unconnected to the character of the person receiving them, is too threatening to the sense of control that the belief provides. If the world is fair, your suffering means something. If the world is unfair, your suffering may mean nothing, and the nothing is unbearable. The just world fallacy produces some of the cruelest reasoning in everyday life. The blaming of victims for their misfortune, the assumption that the poor are lazy, the sick are careless, the lonely are unlikable. Each conclusion a product of the need to believe that the outcome was earned rather than random. Think of a time you looked at someone's misfortune and assumed, quietly, that they must have done something to deserve it, and how the assuming protected you from the more frightening thought that the same thing could happen to you for no reason at all. You do not need to judge anyone's fortune tonight. Let the fairness rest, imagined and necessary, and know that the world does not distribute its outcomes according to merit. And the belief that it does, while comforting, produces a cruelty toward the unfortunate that the comforting never intended. If it feels right, it must be true. If it feels right, it must be true. And this is the appeal to intuition, the fallacy of treating the feeling of correctness as evidence of correctness, of trusting the gut over the data, the instinct over the analysis, the sense of rightness over the demonstration of rightness. Intuition is powerful. It is often useful. It is the product of pattern recognition operating below conscious awareness, and the patterns it detects can be genuinely informative. But intuition is also the product of bias, of conditioning, of emotional association, and the feeling of rightness it produces is identical whether the underlying pattern is real or imagined. The gut feeling that tells you a person is trustworthy is the same gut feeling that tells you a person of a different race is dangerous. The mechanism is the same, the feeling is the same, and the reliability is not guaranteed by the feeling's intensity. Think of a time your intuition was wrong, dramatically, confidently wrong, and how the wrongness felt exactly like the rightness does when intuition is correct, and how indistinguishable the two are from the inside. You do not need to distrust any intuition tonight. Let the gut rest, right and wrong in equal measure, and know that the feeling of rightness is a signal, not a proof. And the signal, while worth attending to, must be tested against evidence before it can be trusted, because the confidence it carries is just as strong when it is leading you astray as when it is leading you home. The simple answer is not always right. The simple answer is not always right. And this is the fallacy of oversimplification, the tendency to prefer the simple explanation over the complex one, not because the simple one is more accurate, but because the simple one is easier to process, and the ease of processing is mistaken by the brain for correctness. The world is complex. The causes of events are multiple. The factors contributing to any outcome are numerous, interacting, and often invisible. But the brain, which has limited processing capacity, prefers the explanation that fits in a single sentence, the cause that can be named in a single word, the solution that requires a single action. The preference for simplicity is so strong that the brain will actively resist a complex explanation, even when the complex one is more accurate, because the resistance is not a judgment of accuracy, but a response to cognitive load. Think of a complex situation you explain to yourself with a single cause, and how the explaining felt like understanding when it was actually a reduction. The complex reality compressed into a simple narrative that lost most of the truth in the compression. You do not need to complicate anything tonight. Let the simple rest beside the complex, and know that the simple answer, while sometimes correct, is always suspicious, because the ease with which it arrived may be a measure not of its truth, but of the brain's preference for the easy over the accurate. Everything happens for a reason or not. Everything happens for a reason, or so the mind insists. And this is the teleological fallacy, the assumption that every event has a purpose, a meaning, a design behind it. The belief that the universe is structured intentionally and that the suffering, the randomness, the chaos, all serve a larger plan that would make sense if you could see it from above. The belief is comforting, and it is unfounded, because the universe, as far as science can determine, does not have intentions, and the patterns the mind finds in events are patterns the mind creates, not patterns the events contain. The child who dies does not die for a reason. The accident does not happen to teach a lesson. The coincidence does not carry a message. The mind, which cannot tolerate meaninglessness, imposes meaning on the meaningless, and the imposing feels like discovery when it is actually invention. Think of a painful event you told yourself happened for a reason, and how the reason, once found, reduced the pain, and how the reduction was not produced by the reason being true, but by the reason being found. You do not need to find reasons tonight. Let the events rest, reasoned and unreasoned, and know that the need for everything to have a purpose is a feature of the mind rather than a feature of the universe. And the universe, unburdened by your need for it to make sense, continues without purpose, without plan, and without any obligation to explain itself. The obvious conclusion that was wrong. The obvious conclusion that was wrong is the error of mistaking obviousness for truth, of assuming that if a conclusion seems self-evident, it must be correct, when in fact, the most dangerous errors in reasoning are often the ones that feel the most obvious. It was obvious that the sun revolves around the earth. It was obvious that heavier objects fall faster. It was obvious that the earth was flat. Each of these conclusions was supported by direct sensory experience, by common observation, by the unanimous agreement of everyone who had ever looked at the sky or dropped an object, and each was completely wrong. The obviousness was not evidence. It was familiarity. The feeling of having always seen it this way, and the familiarity, treated as proof, prevented the questioning that would have revealed the error. The obvious conclusion gets its authority not from logic but from comfort, from the settled feeling of a belief that has never been challenged because challenging it never occurred to anyone. Think of something you believe because it is obvious, and ask whether the obviousness is evidence or just the absence of questioning. And how many obvious truths have fallen throughout history when someone finally asked the question no one thought to ask? You do not need to question the obvious tonight. Let it rest, and know that obviousness is not a measure of truth, but a measure of how long a belief has gone unchallenged. And the unchallenging, comfortable and dangerous, is where the largest errors live. What came first must be better. What came first must be better. And this is the appeal to antiquity, a variant of the appeal to tradition, the specific fallacy of assuming that the original version of something, the first formulation, the earliest practice, the oldest form, is inherently superior to what came later. The original recipe is better. The founding principles are purer. The first intention is more authentic. The fallacy treats priority in time as priority in quality, as though arriving first guaranteed being best, when in fact the earliest version of almost anything is the roughest, the least refined, the version that has not yet benefited from the improvements that time and experience provide. The first draft is not the best draft. The first version is not the best version. The original, while historically important, is not automatically superior to what evolved from it. Think of something you value specifically because it is the original, and ask whether the valuing is based on the quality of the thing or on the sentiment attached to its position in time, and how the sentiment, warm and nostalgic, is doing the work that an evaluation of quality should be doing. You do not need to compare any versions tonight. Let the original rest beside the updated, and know that first does not mean best. And the authority of the original is often the authority of sentiment, rather than the authority of quality. More effort must mean more value. More effort must mean more value. And this is the effort justification fallacy. The belief that the more difficult something was to achieve, the more valuable it must be. The assumption that effort and value are proportional, that the price paid in time, sweat, and suffering automatically increases the worth of the thing achieved. You suffered for this degree, so the degree must be valuable. The relationship was hard, so the relationship must be worth saving. The process was painful, so the result must be meaningful. The effort was real, the value is assumed. And the assumption is wrong, because value is not determined by difficulty, but by the thing itself. And a worthless goal pursued with enormous effort remains a worthless goal, and a valuable outcome achieved easily is no less valuable for the ease. The fallacy is related to cognitive dissonance, the brain resolving the tension between "I suffered for this" and "this might not be worth it" by inflating the worth rather than acknowledging the suffering was wasted. Think of something you value partly because of how hard it was to get, and ask whether the value is in the thing or in the suffering, and how different the evaluation would be if the thing had arrived easily. You do not need to evaluate any effort tonight. Let the work rest, and know that the relationship between effort and value is not proportional, but incidental. And the things most worth having may require little effort, and the things that required the most may not be worth having at all. The rare thing must be precious. The rare thing must be precious. And this is the scarcity fallacy, the assumption that rarity equals value, that the less available something is, the more desirable it must be. Limited edition products sell for more, not because they are better, but because they are fewer. Rare opinions are treated as more profound, not because they are wiser, but because they are uncommon. Exclusive opportunities seem more valuable, not because the opportunity is better, but because fewer people have access. The scarcity triggers a feeling of urgency and importance that has nothing to do with the quality of the thing and everything to do with the availability of it. And the feeling, because it is strong, is treated as evidence of value. Marketers understand this perfectly, creating artificial scarcity to trigger the response, limiting supply to increase perceived demand, offering exclusive access to produce the feeling of privilege. Think of a time you wanted something more because it was rare, and whether the rarity added actual value or only the feeling of value, and how indistinguishable the two felt from the inside. You do not need to pursue anything rare tonight. Let the scarce rest beside the abundant, and know that rarity tells you nothing about quality, that the most valuable things in the world, air, water, love, are not rare at all. And the rarest things in the world are often rare for the simple reason that no one wanted them enough to produce more. If it can be abused, it must be banned. If it can be abused, it must be banned. And this is the fallacy of abuse, the error of arguing that because something can be misused, it should not exist, that the potential for abuse invalidates the thing itself. The internet can be used for harm. Therefore, the internet is dangerous. Free speech can be used to spread lies, therefore free speech should be limited. A tool can be used as a weapon, therefore the tool should be removed. The logic confuses the potential for misuse with the thing being misused, treating the capacity for abuse as identical to the abuse itself, and the confusion, because it is driven by the fear of the worst case, overrides the consideration of the best case, producing a conclusion that removes both the harm and the benefit, rather than addressing the harm while preserving the benefit. Think of something you believe should be restricted because it can be misused, and consider whether the restriction addresses the misuse or eliminates the use, and how the eliminating, while safer, also removes whatever value the thing provided when it was used well. You do not need to restrict anything tonight. Let the tools rest, usable and abusable, and know that the capacity for misuse is a feature of nearly everything valuable, and the removal of everything that can be misused would leave a world not safer, but emptier. The personal is not the universal. The personal is not the universal. And this is the fallacy of projection applied to reasoning. The error of assuming that your personal experience, your feelings, your preferences, and your observations are representative of everyone else's, that what is true for you is true for the world. I find this offensive. Therefore, it is offensive. This worked for me, therefore it works for everyone. I cannot imagine it. Therefore, it is impossible. The personal experience is treated as a universal data point, a single observation elevated to a general truth. And the elevation, because it starts from something real, something genuinely felt, feels like a reasonable extrapolation when it is actually a projection of one experience onto a planet of 8 billion. Think of a belief you hold that is based primarily on your own experience, and how confidently you extend that experience to others, and how the extending feels like empathy when it is actually assumption, the brain using itself as the model for everyone. You do not need to separate the personal from the universal tonight. Let them rest, entangled and distinct, and know that your experience, while real and valid, is one data point in a data set of billions. And the data point, however vivid, does not represent the set. Common sense is not always sense. Common sense is not always sense. And this is the fallacy that encompasses the entire tier. The quiet, devastating recognition that the things you call common sense are often not the product of sense at all, but the product of habit, of culture, of inherited assumption, of the comfortable repetition of beliefs that were never examined, because everyone held them and no one questioned them. Common sense said the earth was flat. Common sense said women could not reason. Common sense said heavier objects fall faster. In each case, the common sense was common and was not sense, a shared belief so widely held that its holding was mistaken for its verification. The phrase common sense is often used to end a debate rather than to win it. The appeal to a shared intuition that silences the questioner by implying that the question itself is foolish. But the questioner, the person who asks why is this common sense, is the person who advances the thinking, because the common sense, when examined, often turns out to be common error. Think of a belief you hold because it is common sense, and ask who verified it, and when, and how, and whether the verification was done or simply assumed. You do not need to question any common sense tonight. Let it rest, common and possibly wrong, and know that the most dangerous beliefs are not the exotic ones that announce themselves as unusual, but the ordinary ones that hide inside the phrase, everyone knows, unchallenged, because the everyone feels like proof. The wisdom that was never wise. The wisdom that was never wise is the whole of this tier gathered into a single, quiet recognition that the common sense truths, the intuitive conclusions, the obvious wisdoms you carry through your life may not be as wise as they feel, because the feeling of wisdom and the reality of wisdom are not the same thing. And the brain, which cannot distinguish between the two from the inside, treats the feeling as sufficient. Every fallacy in this tier felt like common sense. The appeal to nature felt wise. The just world hypothesis felt fair. The simple answer felt satisfying. The teleological thinking felt meaningful. And the feeling, in every case, was the mechanism by which the fallacy hid, using the warmth of intuition to disguise the coldness of broken logic. The wisdom that was never wise is the hardest to detect because it is the most deeply felt, the most widely shared, the most comfortably held, and the most quietly wrong. Think of how much of what you call wisdom is feeling rather than thinking, and how much of your thinking is feeling disguised as thinking, and how the disguise, because it has been worn so long, has become indistinguishable from the real thing. You do not need to strip any disguise tonight. Let the wisdom rest, genuine and false together, and know that the truest sign of wisdom is not the feeling of certainty, but the willingness to question even the things that feel most certain, especially the things that feel most certain, because the certainty is where the fallacies live most comfortably. You only seek what confirms you. You only seek what confirms you. And while we discussed confirmation bias in the cognitive biases video, here it appears as a logical fallacy, the structural error of building an argument exclusively from confirming evidence and treating the one-sided collection as proof. The fallacy is not in the evidence you found. It is in the evidence you did not look for, the disconfirming data, the counter-arguments, the studies that reach the opposite conclusion, all of which exist and all of which were excluded from your evaluation, not because you weighed them and found them wanting, but because you never sought them at all. The one-sided search feels like research. It feels like diligence. But the diligence was directed. The search terms were biased, the sources were pre-selected, and the result, which looks comprehensive, is actually a curated collection that tells one side of a story and presents it as the whole. Genuine investigation requires looking for what would prove you wrong with the same energy you spend looking for what proves you right. And the energy for the disconfirming search is almost never equal, because the brain rewards the finding of support and punishes the finding of challenge. Think of the last time you researched something and how much of the research was aimed at confirming what you already believed, and how the confirming felt like finding when it was actually filtering. You do not need to research anything tonight. Let the one-sided search rest, and know that the beliefs you hold most confidently may be the beliefs you have most selectively supported. The evidence curated by a mind that was never looking for the truth, but only for the reassurance. The evidence that made you dig in deeper. The evidence that made you dig in deeper is the backfire effect applied to argumentation. The observation that when someone presents evidence against a strongly held belief, the belief does not weaken. It strengthens, as though the challenge, rather than undermining the position, reinforced it, the mind responding to the threat by fortifying the walls rather than examining the foundation. The mechanism is identity protection. When a belief is tied to who you are, evidence against the belief becomes evidence against you, and the self, threatened, fights the evidence rather than evaluating it, treating the disconfirming data as an attack rather than information. The more central the belief is to your identity, the stronger the backfire effect, and the stronger the effect, the more impervious the belief becomes to any evidence that challenges it. Think of a belief that has survived every piece of contrary evidence, and how each challenge made you more certain rather than less, and how the increasing certainty felt like the belief being proven when it was actually the belief being defended. You do not need to examine any fortified beliefs tonight. Let them rest, reinforced and untested, and know that the strongest beliefs in your mind may be strong, not because they are right, but because they have been attacked. And the attacking, rather than weakening them, welded them to your identity in a bond that evidence alone can never break. You believe it because you want it true. You believe it because you want it true. And this is wishful thinking elevated to a logical fallacy. The error of accepting a conclusion, not because the evidence supports it, but because the conclusion is desirable, because you want the world to work this way, and the wanting, strong enough, replaces the evaluating. The treatment must work because you need it to. The person must be trustworthy because you need them to be. The opportunity must be real because you need it to be real. In each case, the need is doing the work that evidence should be doing, and the need, because it is emotional, is more compelling than any data, producing a conviction that feels like a reasoned conclusion but is actually a desire wearing the costume of a belief. The fallacy is nearly impossible to detect from the inside because the desirability of the conclusion makes the conclusion feel true. And the feeling of truth, as we have seen throughout this video, is indistinguishable from actual truth in the brain's processing. Think of a belief you hold that you also very much want to be true, and ask whether you would hold it with the same conviction if you did not want it, and how the wanting and the believing have become so entangled that separating them may not be possible. You do not need to separate anything tonight. Let the wanting rest beside the believing, and know that the mind does not distinguish between evidence for a conclusion and desire for a conclusion, and the desire, when it is strong enough, produces the certainty that only evidence should be allowed to produce. The group decided, so it must be right. The group decided, so it must be right. And this is groupthink as a logical fallacy. The error that occurs when the consensus of a group is treated as evidence of truth rather than as evidence of agreement. A group can agree unanimously and be unanimously wrong because the agreement is produced not by independent evaluation, but by social pressure, by the desire to maintain cohesion, by the suppression of dissent, and by the assumption that the confidence of the group must reflect the accuracy of the conclusion. Groupthink is not just a social phenomenon. It is a logical error, the substitution of agreement for evidence, the treatment of how many believe as a proxy for whether the belief is true. The most dangerous aspect of groupthink is that it eliminates the internal corrective mechanisms, the dissenting voices, the devil's advocates, the uncomfortable questions that would have revealed the error if they had been allowed to surface. The group silences them, not with force, but with belonging. The quiet threat that disagreement means exclusion. Think of a time you went along with a group's conclusion not because you were convinced, but because the group seemed convinced, and how the seeming was enough. You do not need to dissent from any group tonight. Let the consensus rest, agreed upon, and possibly wrong, and know that the confidence of a group is not the accuracy of a group. And the louder the agreement, the more likely it is that the dissenting voice, the voice that would have caught the error, was silenced by the very unanimity that made the error feel like truth. The label that replaced the thinking. The label that replaced the thinking is the fallacy of labeling, the error of applying a label to a person, an argument, or an idea, and then treating the label as though it were an evaluation, as though naming the thing in a certain way proves something about its nature. That is just a conspiracy theory. That is socialism. That is pseudoscience. The label arrives, the category is assigned, and the thinking stops because the label has done the thinking's job, placing the thing in a box that the brain already has an opinion about, and the opinion about the box replaces any evaluation of the thing inside it. The label is not an argument. It is a substitute for one. A shortcut that bypasses evaluation by triggering a pre-existing category response. And the response, because it is instant and complete, feels like a conclusion when it is actually a reflex. Think of a time you dismissed something with a label, and how the labeling felt like thinking when it was actually the end of thinking, the moment the evaluation was replaced by the categorization. And the categorization, comfortable and quick, prevented you from ever looking at the thing itself. You do not need to remove any labels tonight. Let them rest, applied and comfortable, and know that the label is one of the most efficient and most dangerous substitutes for thought, because it provides the feeling of having evaluated without any of the work. And the work, which the label was designed to prevent, is the only thing that could have told you whether the label was accurate. You dismissed it because of who said it. You dismissed it because of who said it. And this is the inverse of the appeal to authority, the automatic rejection of an argument based on the identity, status, or group membership of the person making it, rather than on the merit of the argument itself. The idea came from the wrong political party, so it must be wrong. The suggestion came from a competitor, so it must be self-serving. The argument came from someone without credentials, so it must be uninformed. The source is evaluated instead of the content, and the source, found wanting, takes the content down with it. The fallacy is the genetic fallacy in reverse, the dismissal of an idea because of where it came from rather than what it says. And the dismissal feels rational because the source genuinely is flawed, but the flaw of the source does not transfer to the argument, and the argument, stripped of its source, might be perfectly valid. Think of an idea you rejected because of who offered it, and whether you ever evaluated the idea independently or simply used the source as an excuse not to think about the content. You do not need to reevaluate any dismissed ideas tonight. Let the sources rest, flawed and irrelevant to the arguments they carried, and know that the most important idea you have ever rejected may have been rejected, not because it was wrong, but because it arrived wearing the wrong face. The conspiracy that explains everything is the unfalsifiable grand narrative, the theory that accommodates all evidence, that treats both the confirming data and the disconfirming data as support, and that grows stronger with every challenge because the challenge itself is interpreted as part of the conspiracy. The lack of evidence proves the cover-up is effective. The presence of evidence proves the conspiracy is real. The expert denial proves the experts are compromised. The theory is a closed system, hermetically sealed against any data that could disprove it. And the sealing is what makes it compelling. Because a theory that can never be wrong feels like a theory that must be right. But the unfalsifiability, as we discussed earlier, is the theory's weakness disguised as its strength. Because a theory that accommodates everything predicts nothing. And a theory that predicts nothing explains nothing, regardless of how satisfying the explaining feels. Think of a grand theory you find compelling and ask whether there is any evidence that would make you abandon it. And if the answer is no, consider that the theory's invulnerability is not a sign of its truth, but of its structure. You do not need to evaluate any theory tonight. Let the conspiracy rest, all explaining and possibly empty, and know that the theory that survives every challenge may survive, not because it is right, but because it was built to be unchallengeable. The moral high ground that blocked logic. The moral high ground that blocked logic is the fallacy of moral superiority used as argument. The strategy of claiming the ethical position so forcefully that the claim itself replaces the need for logical support. I care about people. Therefore, my policy is correct. This is the compassionate choice. Therefore, it must be right. Anyone who disagrees is heartless. Therefore, disagreement is immoral. The moral claim, presented first, creates an emotional barrier that prevents the logical evaluation that should follow. Because challenging the policy now means challenging the morality, and challenging the morality means accepting the label of being immoral. And the label, as we discussed, is enough to silence most people. The moral high ground is not evidence. Being compassionate does not make a policy effective. Being well-intentioned does not make a conclusion correct. And the equation of moral virtue with logical validity, the assumption that the good person must have the right answer, is a fallacy that exploits the brain's reluctance to separate the ethics of the person from the logic of the position. Think of a time someone won an argument by being more moral rather than more logical, and how the morality made the logic feel unnecessary. You do not need to judge any morality tonight. Let the high ground rest, moral and logically separate, and know that the person with the best intentions can have the worst ideas, and the person with the best ideas can have questionable motives, and the two, intentions and ideas, must be evaluated. The sacred belief that cannot be questioned. The sacred belief that cannot be questioned is the argument from sanctity, the fallacy of declaring a belief so important, so fundamental, so central to identity or culture, that questioning it is treated not as intellectual honesty, but as an attack, a violation, a transgression that reveals more about the questioner's character than about the belief's validity. The sacredness of the belief protects it from examination, and the protection, because it is emotional rather than logical, is impervious to any logical challenge, because the challenge is met not with counter-evidence, but with outrage. And the outrage, being more powerful than any argument, shuts the questioning down. Every culture has sacred beliefs. Every individual has them. And the sacred beliefs, precisely because they are sacred, are the beliefs most likely to be wrong, because they are the beliefs that have been most thoroughly insulated from the questioning that would have corrected them. Think of a belief you hold sacred, and how the sacredness feels like a measure of the belief's importance when it is actually a measure of the belief's protection, and how the protection has prevented the very examination that would have told you whether the belief deserves the sacredness it has been given. You do not need to question anything sacred tonight. Let the sacred rest, protected and unexamined, and know that the beliefs most in need of questioning are the ones you are most forbidden to question. The identity that became the argument. The identity that became the argument is the fallacy of identity politics applied to logic, the error of treating who you are as evidence for what you believe, of substituting personal identity for intellectual reasoning, of arguing that your position must be correct because of your group membership, your lived experience, or your demographic category. The lived experience is real. The identity is valid. But neither is an argument, and the treatment of either as one is a substitution of the personal for the logical, the replacement of, how do we know this is true, with who am I to say this? The identity does not establish the truth of the position. It establishes the perspective of the person holding it. And the perspective, while valuable, is an input to the argument, not a substitute for one. Think of a time your identity was used as an argument, either by you or by someone else, and how the identity, deployed as evidence, felt more compelling than any data because it was personal, and how the personal, because it is unchallengeable, made the position unchallengeable by extension. You do not need to separate your identity from your arguments tonight. Let them rest, intertwined and distinct, and know that who you are informs what you believe but does not validate it. And the validation, which requires evidence and logic, cannot be replaced by identity, however strongly felt. You changed the meaning to win the fight. You changed the meaning to win the fight. And this is equivocation, the fallacy of using the same word with different meanings at different points in the argument, so that the conclusion appears to follow from the premises when it actually does not, because the word changed its meaning between the beginning and the end. The word freedom means one thing in the first sentence and another in the second. And the argument, which depends on the word meaning the same thing throughout, collapses the moment the shift is noticed. But the shift is rarely noticed because the word looks the same, and the brain assumes it means the same. Politicians equivocate with words like justice, equality, rights, and security, using the emotional weight of the word in one sense while applying it in another. And the emotional weight, carried from the first meaning into the second, makes the second meaning feel supported by the emotion the first one generated. Think of a word that was used to persuade you and ask whether the word meant the same thing at the end of the argument as it did at the beginning, and how the persistence of the word disguised the change in its meaning. You do not need to define any words tonight. Let the meanings rest, shifted, and unnoticed, and know that equivocation is one of the subtlest and most effective fallacies, because it uses the trust the brain places in the consistency of language to smuggle an inconsistency through the front door. The belief you defend with your life. The belief you defend with your life is the one most likely to be defended with fallacies, because the more central a belief is to your identity, the more resources the mind devotes to its protection. And the protection, when it runs out of evidence, turns to every fallacy available, deploying ad hominems, appeals to emotion, circular reasoning, and every other broken tool in the arsenal, because the belief must survive, and the surviving, when it cannot be achieved with logic, is achieved with whatever works. The most defended beliefs are not the most evidenced beliefs. They are the most felt beliefs, the ones that are woven into the self so thoroughly that their removal would threaten the self's coherence. And the threat to coherence is what produces the desperation that makes every fallacy feel justified. Think of the belief you defend most fiercely and ask whether the fierceness is proportional to the evidence or to the identity investment, and how the defending, when it is examined honestly, relies less on valid reasoning and more on the emotional and rhetorical tricks this video has been cataloging all night. You do not need to examine any defenses tonight. Let the belief rest, defended, and felt, and know that the correlation between how strongly you defend a belief and how true the belief actually is may be zero, and the defending, however fierce, tells you nothing about the truth and everything about the investment. The worldview built on broken foundations. The worldview built on broken foundations is the whole of this tier gathered into a single, humbling recognition that the beliefs you hold, the worldview you carry, the framework through which you interpret everything that happens to you, is built on foundations that include, alongside genuine evidence and genuine reasoning, a significant proportion of fallacies, biases, errors, and broken logic that have accumulated over a lifetime of thinking and have never been audited. You sought only the confirming evidence. You dug in against the disconfirming evidence. You believed what you wanted to believe. You followed the group. You labeled instead of thinking. You defended the sacred instead of examining it. And the worldview that resulted, which feels solid and well-founded, is partly solid and partly hollow, built on a mix of genuine insight and genuine error that the brain has blended into a single, coherent, confident structure. The coherence is real. The confidence is real. The foundations, examined honestly, are mixed. Think of how confident you feel about your understanding of the world, and how many of the fallacies in this tier are active in that understanding, and how the activity, invisible and permanent, means that the world you understand is partly the world as it is, and partly the world as your fallacies have constructed it. You do not need to audit any foundations tonight. Let the worldview rest, built and mixed, and know that the most honest thing you can do with a worldview is hold it gently, knowing that some of it is true and some of it is broken, and that the broken parts, because they feel identical to the true parts from the inside, may never be fully separable from the whole. You think in stories, not in logic. You think in stories, not in logic, and this is the narrative fallacy at its deepest. Not a specific error in reasoning, but a structural limitation of the human mind. The fact that the brain processes the world through stories, through characters and causes and sequences, and that the story format, while powerful, systematically distorts the reality it describes. Stories require causes. Reality often has none. Stories require characters with motives. Reality contains systems with no intentions. Stories require beginnings, middles, and ends. Reality is continuous, with no natural punctuation. The brain forces reality into the story format because the story format is how the brain processes, stores, and retrieves information, and the forcing, which is invisible, produces a world that looks more intentional, more causal, more meaningful, and more narratively satisfying than the world actually is. You do not see the world and then tell a story about it. You see the world through the story being the lens rather than the report, and the lens, because it is built into the processing system itself, cannot be removed. Think of how you understand your own life, as a story with a direction, a meaning, a through line. And consider that the story is something your brain imposed on a sequence of events that may have no direction, no meaning, and no through line at all. You do not need to rewrite any story tonight. Let the narrative rest, imposed and comforting, and know that the deepest fallacy is not a specific error in reasoning, but the format of the reasoning itself. the story-shaped mind, living in a world that has no plot. The map you confused with the territory. The map you confused with the territory is one of the deepest epistemological fallacies. The error of mistaking your model of reality for reality itself, of treating the description as the thing described, of confusing the menu with the meal. Alfred Korzybski coined the phrase, "The map is not the territory," to capture this error. And the error is so fundamental that it underlies nearly every other fallacy in this video, because every fallacy, at its root, is a case of the map being mistaken for the territory. The brain's model of reality being trusted as though it were reality. The representation being treated as the thing represented. Your beliefs about the world are not the world. Your perceptions of a person are not the person. Your understanding of a situation is not the situation. Each one is a map, a simplified, distorted, perspective-dependent representation that is useful for navigation, but that is not the thing it represents. The map is always simpler than the territory. The map is always missing information the territory contains. And the map, because it is the only thing the brain can access, is treated as the territory by default. Think of how confidently you navigate the world using your maps, your models, your understanding, and how the confidence is the confidence of a person who has forgotten they are reading a map and believes they are seeing the land. You do not need to redraw any map tonight. Let the representation rest, useful and incomplete, and know that the world you think you see is a map your brain drew. And the territory it represents is larger, more complex, and more mysterious than any map could ever contain. The binary brain in a spectrum world. The binary brain in a spectrum world is the structural fallacy of thinking in categories when reality operates in gradients, of dividing the continuous into the discrete, of cutting the spectrum into boxes and then arguing about which box things belong in. Good or bad, right or wrong, true or false, with us or against us. The brain prefers binaries because binaries are easier to process, easier to remember, easier to argue about, and the preference, while efficient, produces a systematic distortion of every reality that exists on a spectrum, which is nearly every reality there is. Intelligence is a spectrum. Morality is a spectrum. Health is a spectrum. Truth, in most domains, is a spectrum. And the brain, forcing each one into binary categories, loses the nuance that the spectrum contains, the middle ground, the gray area, the both, and that the either-or cannot accommodate. Think of how many of your judgments are binary, yes or no, good or bad, right or wrong, and how many of the realities those judgments address are actually spectra, continuous ranges that the binary flattens into 2 points. You do not need to expand any categories tonight. Let the binaries rest, simple and distorting, and know that the brain's preference for 2 boxes is a processing efficiency, not a feature of reality. And the reality, which runs in gradients, is always more complex, more nuanced, and more interesting than the boxes can hold. The certainty that prevented learning. The certainty that prevented learning is the fallacy of closed-mindedness as a reasoning error. The structural problem that occurs when a person becomes so certain of their position that they stop processing new information because the certainty has told them there is nothing left to process. Certainty feels like the end of the learning process, the arrival at the truth, the completion of the investigation, and the feeling of completion shuts down the system that would have continued investigating if the certainty had not arrived. But certainty is not the end of learning. It is the end of openness, and the end of openness is the beginning of stagnation, because the world continues to produce information that the certain mind is no longer equipped to receive. The most certain people are often the least informed, not because certainty causes ignorance, but because certainty prevents the updating that would have corrected it. Think of how certain you are about something and ask whether the certainty is the product of thorough investigation or the product of having stopped investigating, and how the stopping, which felt like arriving, may have been the moment you turned away from the very information you most needed. You do not need to question any certainty tonight. Let the knowing rest, certain and closed, and know that the feeling of having arrived is the most effective way the mind has of preventing itself from going further. You see the world through a keyhole. You see the world through a keyhole, and this is the fallacy of limited perspective elevated to a structural truth. The recognition that every view you have of every situation is a partial view, a slice of the full picture determined by where you are standing, what you have been taught to look for, and what your cognitive and perceptual systems are capable of processing. No one sees the full picture. No one has access to the complete data. No one stands in the position from which the whole of any situation is visible. And yet every person reasons as though their view is the view, treating the slice they can see as the whole, building conclusions on partial data and defending those conclusions as though they were built on the complete set. The partiality is not a correctable error. It is a structural limitation. You will never see the whole picture of anything, because the whole picture is larger than any individual mind can contain. Think of the most complete understanding you have of any situation and consider that the understanding, however thorough, is a keyhole, a narrow aperture through which a vast scene is being viewed, and the scene, beyond the keyhole, contains information that would change your conclusions if you could see it. You do not need to widen any view tonight. Let the keyhole rest, narrow and specific, and know that humility about the limits of your perspective is not modesty but accuracy. The honest recognition that you are always seeing less than there is, and always concluding more than the seeing warrants. The mind that cannot think about itself. The mind that cannot think about itself is the deepest structural limitation of all. The fact that the instrument you use to evaluate your own thinking is the same instrument that is doing the thinking, and the same instrument that contains the errors you are trying to detect. You cannot step outside your own cognition to evaluate your own cognition, the way you cannot lift the platform you are standing on. Every evaluation of your own reasoning is conducted by the same biased, fallacy-prone, story-driven, binary-preferring, certainty-addicted mind that produced the reasoning in the first place, and the evaluation, conducted by the same flawed instrument, is subject to the same flaws, in an infinite regress that never reaches solid ground. This is why you cannot see your own fallacies, even after learning about them. The seeing is being done by the same system that is producing them, and the system cannot observe itself accurately because it is using itself as both the observer and the observed. Think of how you evaluate your own thinking and who is doing the evaluating, and how the evaluator is the same mind that made the errors, equipped with the same biases, running on the same broken software. You do not need to evaluate anything tonight. Let the mind rest, self-referential and limited, and know that the most honest admission a mind can make is that it cannot fully know itself, that the instrument and the error are the same thing, and that the seeing, however careful, is always done through the very lens it is trying to examine. The language that shaped your thoughts. The language that shaped your thoughts is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis applied to everyday reasoning. The observation that the language you think in does not merely express your thoughts, but constrains them, limiting what you can think to what your language can say. Languages that have more words for a concept allow more nuanced thinking about that concept. Languages that grammatically encode certain distinctions force their speakers to notice those distinctions. Languages that lack a concept make the concept harder for their speakers to form. The fallacy is not in the language, but in the assumption that your thoughts are free, that you are thinking independently of the linguistic structure you are thinking through, when in fact the structure is shaping the thoughts as surely as a riverbed shapes the water. You are not thinking freely. You are thinking within the channels your language has carved, and the channels, because they are invisible, feel like freedom when they are actually direction. Think of a thought you struggle to articulate and consider that the struggle may not be about the thought's complexity, but about your language's capacity, the channel not being wide enough for the water, and the thought, unable to find its linguistic shape, remaining half-formed. You do not need to expand any language tonight. Let the words rest, shaping and constraining, and know that the thoughts you think are partly your own and partly your language's, and the language, which you did not choose, has been choosing your thoughts for you, silently, since the day you learned to speak. The question that contains its answer. The question that contains its answer is a deeper version of the loaded question discussed earlier, elevated here to a structural insight about how the framing of a question predetermines the range of possible answers. Every question is a frame, and the frame excludes certain answers while including others. And the exclusion, because it happens at the level of the question rather than at the level of the answer, is invisible to the person answering. The question, what is the best way to grow the economy, excludes the possibility that growing the economy is not the goal. The question, how do we win the war, excludes the possibility of not fighting. The question, which candidate should I vote for, excludes the possibility of questioning the system itself. The frame of the question, the assumptions embedded in its structure, determine the terrain on which the answer must be built, and the terrain, chosen by the questioner, may exclude the territory where the best answer lives. Think of the questions that have shaped your thinking and how the questions themselves, not the answers, determined what you thought about. You do not need to reframe any question tonight. Let the frames rest, containing and constraining, and know that the most powerful form of influence is not the providing of answers, but the asking of questions. Because the question, by defining the terrain, determines which answers are possible and which are not. The frame you never chose. The frame you never chose is the interpretive framework through which you see every situation. And that was not selected by you through deliberate evaluation, but installed by your upbringing, your culture, your education, and your experience before you were old enough to know that frameworks existed, let alone that you were receiving one. The frame determines what you see and what you miss, what you consider important and what you ignore, what you find threatening and what you find promising. And the determining happens so far below conscious awareness that the frame and the reality it produces feel like the same thing. You do not see a situation through a frame. You see a situation, and the frame is invisible. And the invisibility of the frame is what makes it powerful, because a frame you cannot see is a frame you cannot question. And a frame you cannot question is a frame that controls your thinking without your knowledge. Think of how you see the world and consider that the seeing has a shape, a frame, a structure, and the structure was not chosen but given. And the giving happened before you could evaluate what you were being given. You do not need to change any frame tonight. Let the frame rest, given and invisible, and know that the most important structure in your thinking is the one you have never seen. And the not seeing is not a failure of your vision, but a feature of the frame's design. You mistake understanding for agreement. You mistake understanding for agreement, and this is one of the quietest and most pervasive fallacies in human discourse. The assumption that if someone truly understood your position, they would agree with it, and the corollary that anyone who disagrees must not understand. The fallacy converts every disagreement into a failure of communication, the assumption that the other person would come around if you could just explain it better, if they would just listen more carefully, if they just understood what you were really saying. But understanding and agreement are independent operations. A person can understand your position perfectly and still disagree, not because they missed the point, but because they weighed it differently, valued different things, or reached a different conclusion from the same premises. Think of a time you kept explaining your position to someone who kept disagreeing, and how the explaining continued because you assumed the disagreement was a failure of understanding rather than a genuine difference of evaluation. You do not need to explain anything tonight. Let the understanding rest, separate from the agreement, and know that the person who understands you and still disagrees is not failing to listen. They are listening, and what they are hearing, fully understood, is not enough to change their mind. And the not changing is not a failure of their comprehension, but a success of their independent thinking. The paradox of knowing you are wrong. The paradox of knowing you are wrong is the meta-fallacy that haunts every discussion of fallacies. The uncomfortable truth that knowing about fallacies does not make you immune to them, and that the person most convinced they have overcome their fallacies is often the person most thoroughly in their grip. The knowledge creates a dangerous confidence, the feeling that because you can name the fallacies, you can avoid them. And the confidence, being itself a form of the certainty that prevents learning, makes the fallacies harder to detect, rather than easier. You know about confirmation bias and you still confirm. You know about the narrative fallacy and you still think in stories. You know about the appeal to emotion and you are still persuaded by feelings. The knowing sits in the conscious mind while the fallacies operate beneath it, and the operation, untouched by the knowing, continues as it always has. Think of how many fallacies in this video you recognized and how many you will commit tomorrow, and how the recognizing and the committing will coexist in the same mind without conflict. You do not need to resolve any paradox tonight. Let it rest, unsolvable and honest, and know that the most accurate thing a fallible mind can know about itself is that it is fallible. And the knowing, while it does not fix the fallibility, changes the relationship to it. The fallacies that are part of you. The fallacies that are part of you are the whole of this tier gathered into a single, quiet acceptance that the deep fallacies described tonight are not correctable errors, but permanent features of how your mind works, structural limitations of a cognitive system that was built for survival rather than for truth, and that the limitations, while they can be acknowledged, can never be fully overcome. You will always think in stories. You will always confuse the map with the territory. You will always think in binaries. You will always be limited by your perspective, your language, your frame, and your inability to observe your own thinking from the outside. These are not failures. They are the specifications of the instrument you were given. A mind that is brilliant and biased and beautiful and broken, all at the same time. And the all at the same time is not a contradiction but a description, the most accurate description of a human mind that a human mind can produce. Think of the mind you carry and how it has gotten you this far, through all its fallacies, all its errors, all its broken logic and brilliant insights, using the same flawed instrument for everything, and how the instrument, for all its flaws, has been enough. You do not need to improve the instrument tonight. Let the fallacies rest, structural and permanent, and know that the mind you have, broken and brilliant, is the only one available. And the acceptance of its brokenness, held alongside the gratitude for its brilliance, is the most honest and the most human thing you can feel. Now you can hear the break. Now you can hear the break. The quiet crack in the logic that you could not hear before tonight. The sound of a fallacy operating in an argument that, before this video, would have passed through your mind unchallenged, accepted as valid because it felt valid, believed because it sounded right. The crack was always there. The fallacy was always present. But the hearing was not, because the brain does not come equipped with a fallacy detector. And the arguments that sounded right because the brain is designed to process rhetoric, not logic. And the rhetoric was doing its job while the logic was breaking beneath it. Now you can hear the break. Not always, not perfectly, not in your own thinking, where the detection is hardest, but in the arguments of others, in the news, in the conversations, in the persistent, daily stream of persuasion that passes through your mind and asks at every moment to be accepted without examination. The hearing does not make you immune. It makes you slightly more resistant, slightly more cautious, slightly more willing to pause before accepting. And the pause, which is the smallest possible unit of intellectual honesty, is the most valuable thing this video has produced. Think of how many arguments you would have accepted without question before tonight, and how the question, now installed, will change. Not everything, but something. You do not need to catch any breaks tonight. Let the hearing rest, newly trained and imperfect, and know that the ability to hear the break is not the ability to avoid the break, but it is the first step, the first honest step, toward a mind that does not accept everything it is told simply because the telling was done. The awareness that does not fix. The awareness that does not fix is the honest conclusion of every lesson in this video, that knowing about a fallacy does not protect you from it, that naming the error does not prevent the error, and that the awareness, while genuinely valuable, is not the cure it feels like it should be. You now know about circular reasoning, and you will still reason in circles. You know about the appeal to emotion, and you will still be moved by feelings that are not evidence. You know about the straw man, and you will still argue against positions your opponents did not take. The awareness sits in one layer of the mind, while the fallacies operate in another. And the two layers, though they exist in the same brain, do not fully communicate, which is why you can know you are wrong and still feel right, and why the feeling of rightness, even after 100 fallacies, still carries more weight than the knowing. Think of the gap between what you now know and what you will do tomorrow, and how the gap, honest and unbridgeable, is the space where the human condition lives. You do not need to bridge any gap tonight. Let the awareness rest, valuable and insufficient, and know that the knowing, while it does not fix, changes something. A shift in the weight of your certainty, a loosening of the grip, a quiet, permanent, barely perceptible increase in the doubt that every honest mind needs. Humility is the first honest thought. Humility is the first honest thought, and after 100 fallacies, the most appropriate response is not mastery, but humility. The quiet, clear-eyed recognition that your mind is not the reliable instrument you believed it was, that your reasoning is systematically flawed in ways you cannot detect from the inside, and that the person most convinced of their own rationality is often the person most deeply in the grip of their own fallacies. Humility does not mean you stop thinking. It means you stop trusting your thinking so completely, holding every conclusion with a lighter grip, treating every belief as provisional, approaching every certainty with the quiet understanding that the certainty itself may be the fallacy. The humble mind is not a weak mind. It is the mind that has seen its own errors and chosen to continue thinking anyway, not because the thinking is reliable, but because it is the only tool available. And the tool, used with awareness of its limitations, produces better results than the tool used in ignorance of them. Think of how different your thinking would be if every conclusion came with a quiet footnote that said, "I might be wrong about this," and how the footnote, while it would reduce your confidence, would increase your accuracy. You do not need to be humble about anything tonight. Let the humility rest, arrived and gentle, and know that the first honest thought a mind can have after seeing its own fallacies is not, "I now see clearly," but "I now see how unclear my seeing has always been." The pause between the thinking and believing. The pause between the thinking and the believing is the most valuable thing this video can give you. The small, quiet gap between the moment a conclusion arrives in your mind and the moment you accept it as true. Before tonight, the gap did not exist. The conclusion arrived and the believing followed instantly. The brain accepting its own output, the way a stomach accepts food, automatically, without inspection, without the pause that would allow the conclusion to be examined before it is swallowed. The pause changes everything. Not because the pause produces the right answer, but because the pause prevents the automatic acceptance of the wrong one, creating a space in which the conclusion can be held, examined, tested, and either accepted or released, rather than swallowed whole by a mind that does not know it has the option of spitting something out. Think of how many conclusions you have accepted today without pausing, and how many of them were accepted not because they were evaluated, but because they arrived. And the arriving was enough. You do not need to pause tonight. Let the conclusions rest, arrived and unexamined, and know that the pause, once learned, becomes a permanent feature of your thinking. A tiny, invisible, enormously powerful gap between the receiving and the believing. And the gap, maintained, is the difference between a mind that thinks and a mind that thinks about its thinking. Hold every conclusion lightly. Hold every conclusion lightly. And this is the practical instruction that emerges from 100 fallacies. The understanding that if every conclusion is potentially contaminated by biases, distorted by emotions, built on broken logic, framed by language, and limited by perspective, then no conclusion deserves the death grip certainty the brain would like to give it. The light hold is not doubt. It is grace, the quiet willingness to be wrong, the gentle acknowledgement that the conclusion may be the best you can do right now and may not be the best that exists. And the acknowledgement, carried lightly, makes you more open to revision, more responsive to new evidence, and more capable of the kind of thinking that updates rather than defends. The heavy hold produces rigidity. The light hold produces flexibility. And the flexibility, in a world that is constantly producing new information, is more valuable than the certainty that the heavy hold provides. Think of the conclusion you hold most tightly and imagine holding it lightly, not releasing it but loosening the grip, and how the loosening changes, not the conclusion but your relationship to it. You do not need to loosen anything tonight. Let every conclusion rest, held, and provisional, and know that the person who holds lightly is the person who can change. And the changing, rather than being a sign of weakness, is the sign of a mind that is still alive, still learning, still willing to discover that what it believed was not quite right. The question that matters more than the answer. The question that matters more than the answer is the recognition that the quality of your thinking is determined not by the conclusions you reach, but by the questions you ask, because the question is the frame, and the frame determines what the answer can be. A better question produces a better answer. A deeper question produces a deeper answer. A more honest question produces a more honest answer. And the willingness to ask, to question, to challenge even the things that feel settled is the engine of every improvement in understanding that has ever occurred. The answer ends the thinking. The question begins it. And the person who values the question over the answer is the person whose thinking continues to develop, because the questioning never stops. And the not stopping is what keeps the mind alive. Think of the questions you stopped asking because you found answers that satisfied you, and how the satisfaction ended the inquiry, and how the ending of the inquiry froze your understanding at the point where the question was abandoned. You do not need to ask any questions tonight. Let the answers rest, satisfying and incomplete, and know that the most valuable thing a mind can carry is not a collection of answers, but a habit of questioning. And the habit, maintained, keeps every answer provisional and every understanding. The mind that doubts itself is wiser. The mind that doubts itself is wiser than the mind that does not. And this is the quiet paradox at the heart of all intellectual honesty, that the wisest position is not certainty, but calibrated uncertainty. The accurate assessment of what you know and what you do not, held with the honesty that recognizes the assessment itself, may be wrong. The mind that doubts itself is not paralyzed. It is more accurate, because the doubt corrects for the overconfidence that the undoubting mind carries, and the correction, while it feels like a loss of strength, is actually a gain of precision. The confident mind goes further, but goes wrong more often. The doubting mind goes more slowly, but stays closer to the truth. And the closeness to the truth, however uncomfortable, is more valuable than the distance covered by the confident mind racing in the wrong direction. Think of how much more reliable your thinking would be if every conclusion carried a margin of doubt, and how the margin, rather than weakening the conclusion, would strengthen it. Because a conclusion that includes its own uncertainty is a conclusion that has accounted for reality rather than pretending it does not exist. You do not need to doubt anything tonight. Let the doubt rest, and know that the mind that says, "I might be wrong," is the mind most likely to be right. You will still be wrong tomorrow. You will still be wrong tomorrow. And this is the most honest thing a video about logical fallacies can tell you, that 100 lessons in broken logic will not make you logical, that the awareness of the errors will not prevent the errors, and that the person who listened to this entire video will walk into tomorrow and commit the same fallacies they committed yesterday, with slightly more awareness and exactly the same vulnerability. The fallacies are not learned behaviors that can be unlearned. They are structural features of the mind that can be recognized but not removed. And the recognition, while valuable, does not change the structure. You will still be anchored by the first number. You will still generalize from one example. You will still think in stories. You will still mistake the map for the territory. And the mistakes, because they feel like thinking, will continue to feel like truth. Think of this not as a failure, but as an honesty, the most accurate description of a human mind that a human mind can produce. You do not need to prevent any mistakes tonight. Let the wrongness rest, approaching and inevitable, and know that the person who knows they will be wrong tomorrow is better prepared for tomorrow than the person who believes they will be right, because the knowing makes room for the correction. And the correction, however late it arrives, is the only form of progress available to a mind that cannot fix itself, but can, with patience and humility, catch itself. The beauty of a mind that tries. The beauty of a mind that tries is what remains. After 100 fallacies have been named and none of them removed, the recognition that the mind you carry, flawed and brilliant, broken and reaching, biased and curious, is the most extraordinary instrument the universe has ever produced. And its extraordinary quality lies not in its accuracy, which is poor, but in its persistence, which is magnificent. The mind tries. It tries to understand a world it was not designed to understand. It tries to reason its way through problems it was not equipped to solve. It tries to see clearly through a lens it cannot clean. And the trying, imperfect and endless, is the most beautiful thing about being human. The daily, dogged, unrewarded effort of a consciousness that knows it is wrong about most things, and continues anyway, to think. Think of everything your mind has attempted today, every problem it tried to solve, every conclusion it tried to reach, every understanding it tried to build, using the same broken tools, and how the trying, not the succeeding, is what makes the mind worth having. You do not need to try tonight. Let the mind rest, and know that the beauty is not in the answers it found, but in the questions it asked. And the asking, continued tomorrow, is the only thing that matters. The gentle truth about your thinking. The gentle truth about your thinking is simple enough to carry into sleep. Your mind is flawed. It reasons in circles, falls for emotions, sees patterns in noise, thinks in stories, confuses the map with the land, and defends its beliefs with every broken tool available. And your mind is brilliant. It has carried you through every day of your life, solving problems it was never designed to solve, understanding things it was never built to understand, reaching for truth with an instrument that was designed for survival, and yet, somehow, occasionally, touches something real. Both are true, the flawed and the brilliant, the broken and the reaching. Let this truth settle gently now, and know that your mind, exactly as it is enough. It has always been enough. And the knowing, held softly, is the most honest thought it has ever had. The thoughts that grow quieter now. The thoughts that grow quieter now are the ones that have been running all night. The fallacies and the naming and the seeing and the doubting. All of them slowing, all of them losing their edges. The way thoughts always lose their edges when sleep comes close. The circular reasoning is unwinding. The loaded questions are unloading. The straw men are lying down. The whole catalog of broken logic is closing its book, and what remains is only the quiet, the gentle, imperfect quiet of a mind that has seen its own tricks and is now, at last, too tired to perform any of them. Let the thoughts grow quiet. Let them blur. Let the 100 fallacies rest, named and forgiven, each one a small crack in the brilliant, broken instrument you carry everywhere you go. The mind that finally rests. The mind that finally rests is yours, right now. The same mind that spent 100 topics catching its own mistakes and that is now, at last, too close to sleep to catch anything at all. There is nothing left to think tonight. The fallacies are sleeping. The logic is sleeping. The broken, beautiful, persistent, humble, extraordinary mind is doing what it does every night, releasing the world it spent all day, misunderstanding, and drifting into a place where no arguments are made, no conclusions are reached, and no mistakes are possible. Because the thinking, for a few hours, has finally stopped. Let the mind rest. Let the fallacies rest. Let the whole system, broken and brilliant, settle into the quiet it has earned. You have thought enough. You have doubted enough. You have tried enough. And now there is nothing left but this: the dark, the warmth, the gentle weight of tiredness, and a mind that has, at last, permission to stop thinking and simply, finally,